So, as we all know, the Duel of the Fates is one of the most important confrontations in all of Star Wars. The outcome of that fight determined the path that Anakin Skywalker would walk and led to the creation of Darth Vader. And while Qui-Gon was tragically killed, Obi-Wan Kenobi was able to defeat Darth Maul by cutting him in half. While Maul did end up surviving, it was still an impressive victory for Obi-Wan considering that he was just a Padawan. However, the most shocking thing about Maul's defeat may truly be that Obi-Wan admitted to completely disregarding his Jedi training and giving in to his anger, letting the dark side of the Force guide his actions as he fought the Sith Lord. Just days after the duel, the High Council requested that he make a report of his encounters with Darth Maul, and it was here that Obi-Wan spoke of giving into the dark side very briefly, and this comes from the Legends Encyclopedia Jedi vs. Sith: The Essential Guide to the Force. You can obviously see how aggressively and angrily Obi-Wan was fighting in the film too, and additional descriptions from the novelization really flesh out how he gave into those emotions. So I'd like to get into those first before we look at his report from the encyclopedia. The book actually states that Obi-Wan's anger began to grow before Qui-Gon's death, when they first became trapped by the laser doors in the long service corridor. Obi-Wan prowled the front end of the corridor like a caged animal. He was furious at himself for getting trapped so far from Qui-Gon, and furious with his master for letting this happen by rushing ahead instead of waiting for him. But he was worried too, because he knew that they should have won this battle long ago, and against any other opponent they would have. But Obi-Wan knew that this Sith Lord was battle-trained and seasoned well beyond anyone that they had ever encountered before. He had matched them blow for blow, and they were no closer to winning this fight than they were at the beginning. When the doors opened again, Obi-Wan was able to clear all of them but the last, and was forced to watch helplessly as Qui-Gon faced Darth Maul alone. He felt desperate as the Sith dealt a killing blow through Qui-Gon's midsection, and when the lasers abruptly shut off again, Obi-Wan rushed out, seething with rage. He charged out of the service tunnel, abandoning any pretense of observing even the slightest caution. He barreled into Darth Maul with such fury that he almost knocked both of them off the ledge and into the abyss. He struck at the Sith Lord with his lightsaber as if his own safety meant nothing, lost in a red haze of rage and frustration, consumed by his grief for Qui-Gon and his failure to protect his master. So just from the way it's described in the novelization, it seems pretty obvious that Obi-Wan gave into his emotions. If you couldn't tell just from watching the movie, you'd obviously see the blatant implication from the book. But the most interesting part comes from this report written in Obi-Wan's own words in first person as he recounts his encounters with Darth Maul and actually admits to the council that he did give into the dark side. It is 5 days since the death of my master. At the request of the Jedi Council, I make this report of my encounters with the Sith. The first encounter was on Tatooine. My master, Qui-Gon Jinn, and I were escorting Queen Amidala from Naboo to Coruscant when the hyperdrive of the Queen's starship became damaged and we were forced to land on the desert planet. Repairs had just been completed as Qui-Gon was returning to our landing site from the city of Mos Espa. He brought with him the Force-sensitive boy he discovered, Anakin Skywalker. According to Qui-Gon, they were within sight of the ship when a black-clad figure came racing from the dunes on a repulsor lift speeder. The figure leapt at them and ignited a lightsaber and attacked, but Qui-Gon managed to instruct Anakin to run for the ship. I was inside the ship's cockpit when the Queen's security head, Captain Panaka, came running in with Anakin. It disturbs me to realize that I hadn't sensed even the slightest danger before Panaka's alert. Outside the cockpit viewport, I saw Qui-Gon fighting the dark figure. I directed the ship's captain to fly toward Qui-Gon, who was able to leap on board before we ascended from the planet, leaving the attacker behind. Qui-Gon was winded, but was compelled to note that his opponent was well trained in the Jedi arts. When we next saw this enemy, we were assisting in the defense of Naboo against the Trade Federation's droid armies. Close up, he resembled a male Zabrak, but his face was so completely covered with black markings that identification was difficult. He used a double-bladed lightsaber and moved incredibly fast. Just as I sensed that the creature was aware that Qui-Gon and I would beat him, he found a way to divide us. Moments later, we were separated by laser doors in a security hallway. I could do nothing but watch as our enemy struck down Qui-Gon. When the laser door lifted, I gave in to my anger as I charged the Dark Warrior. I absolutely wanted to destroy him. He used my anger against me, actually fed off of my fury, gaining strength as I exhausted my own. I lost my lightsaber and he had me. But then I saw my master's weapon, and as I reached out for it, I heard Qui-Gon's words, telling me to be mindful of the living force. The force guided my movements, and it was by Qui-Gon's blade that his killer was felled. Whether our adversary was stalking us or attempting to assassinate the Queen, we may never know. He was certainly a Sith, but was he master or apprentice? I believe it is only a matter of time before we find out. Anticipating a future encounter, I am compelled to remind all Jedi of what they have been told since their earliest training. Do not lose yourselves to anger, even briefly as I did, for not only is this against our code, but it will make the enemy stronger. So guys, I thought that this was fascinating. I've seen some theory videos and just questions about, did Obi-Wan use the dark side to defeat Darth Maul in The Phantom Menace? Because you can obviously see that he's super angry in the movie just from Obi-Wan's facial expressions and stuff, but the book also describes him being really angry and aggressive and stuff. But I had marked this page in the encyclopedia a long time ago and forgot about it. And yesterday I was just flipping through looking for video ideas, and I reread this whole passage, and I had completely forgotten that Obi-Wan just straight up admits to giving into his emotions and giving into the dark side of the Force in this report to the Council, which is really, really interesting. And even though it's Legends now, it's, part of Legends, this encyclopedia is Legends, I still think it's great lore. It's fascinating to think about. I thought it was really interesting, and it's something that I think adds just some depth to Obi-Wan's character and to his development throughout the prequel trilogy, especially considering that he was a Padawan in episode 1, so he's still learning. He wasn't even a knight. He was still young, and he was able to defeat Darth Maul, but he gave into the dark side for a little bit, and then he used Qui-Gon's knowledge and teachings to actually cut Maul in half and fly out of the pit after Maul used his own anger against him. So I thought that was really awesome. I really liked that description about using Qui-Gon's words to focus on the living force, and I thought that was cool. So let me know if you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to like. Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to another video. I hope that you're all doing well. Today, I want to talk about a very interesting part of canon lore, something that is alluded to when Obi-Wan kills Maul in Rebels, which is Obi-Wan believing that Luke, not Anakin, was the chosen one. Obviously, coming off the Jedi Purge and the rise of the Empire, Obi-Wan's perspective on things had been skewed. The dark side was stronger than ever, the Sith had won, and Anakin had become Darth Vader. Thus, Obi-Wan concluded that the prophecy may have been misread by the Jedi, just as Yoda had speculated in Revenge of the Sith, and he began to wonder if Luke could be the one destined to bring balance to the Force. Spending 19 years in exile on Tatooine, Obi-Wan had a ton of time to think on all of this as he watched over Luke, and this is all explained in the canon book Skywalker: A Family at War. Interestingly enough, Obi-Wan's thoughts on this matter actually play into why he didn't tell Luke the truth about Anakin and Vader being the same person. In the years that Obi-Wan had hid himself in the deserts of Tatooine, repenting the part he had unwittingly played in the fall of the Jedi and the Republic, the galaxy at large seemed to have forgotten about the Jedi Order, thanks to the cruel propaganda of the Empire. Most of those who had some knowledge of the Jedi considered them to be an ancient, cult-like religion, whose followers devoted themselves to some all-powerful energy that probably never existed. After the Order's fall, Obi-Wan found solace in his simple life beyond the Dune Sea, spending his days meditating among the Bantha. He spent much of his time watching the young Luke Skywalker's home life from afar. He fervently wished to train the boy just as he had his father, making up for the mistakes he had made the first time. To that end, he kept Anakin's lightsaber as an inheritance that he hoped Luke would one day take. Older and wiser, he believed he could make things right in the galaxy by helping Luke reach his full potential in the Force. Another interesting detail regarding this actually comes from the novelization of Revenge of the Sith, in the scene where Yoda, Obi-Wan, and Bail Organa discuss what to do with the Skywalker twins. Obi-Wan told Yoda that he wanted to take Luke and train him as a Jedi from birth, the way that he believed Anakin should have been trained, but Yoda actually forbade him from doing so. Yoda wanted Luke to remain safe with the Lars family and grow up like a normal child. So Obi-Wan was forced to wait. Also due to the fact that Owen Lars was adamant that Luke should know nothing of the Jedi or Anakin. Owen didn't want to forget the past, but he feared that the Skywalker genes would one day turn his young nephew into a vengeful killer, remembering how Anakin had reacted to his mother's death. Regardless, Obi-Wan knew that the boy was strong in the Force, and the day would come when he would be old enough to choose his own path. In time, Obi-Wan began to wonder if perhaps the prophecy had been misread, and it was Luke who was the chosen one. By the time of A New Hope, Luke still knew virtually nothing about the Jedi Order or the Force. In his solitude, Obi-Wan had come to a realization, a phrase he was fond of repeating: "The truth is often what we make of it." During the 19 years of his exile, he had thought long and hard about what answers he might give to Luke's questions one day. Thus, after rescuing Luke from some Tusken Raiders, Obi-Wan told him only what he believed the young man needed to know, the most basic facts as he saw them. Their conversation laid the foundation for Luke's initiation into the ways of the Jedi, while Obi-Wan continued to shield him from the darkest truths of his heritage. He decided that was actually in accordance with ancient Jedi teaching, since disclosing the shocking truth that Anakin had become Darth Vader was a revelation worthy of the Jedi trials. Thus, Obi-Wan believed that Luke should not know the truth until he was ready to overcome Jedi trials and become a full Jedi Knight. Obi-Wan described Anakin to Luke as a great pilot, a cunning warrior, and a loyal friend. He also admitted to serving as the former master of the Sith Lord Darth Vader before he turned to evil and hunted the Jedi to extinction. Factually, both statements were true, but he dared not connect the two identities, so Obi-Wan said that Vader had betrayed and murdered Anakin. Obi-Wan did this because he thought that if Luke truly was the chosen one, then he would have to kill Vader to restore balance to the Force. So like I said, I love this little bit of lore. This idea in canon is something that I picked up on when I watched the episode where Obi-Wan kills Maul in Rebels for the first time. For those of you who don't remember, maybe you've never seen it, Maul asks Obi-Wan if he is the chosen one, referring to the person that Obi-Wan is protecting on Tatooine. Maul knew that Obi-Wan had some purpose. He was hiding there to protect someone. He just didn't know that it was Luke or Anakin's child or anything like that. So Maul says, "Is he the chosen one?" And Obi-Wan says, "He is." So that's the first time, I believe, in canon that we heard Obi-Wan say that he thought Luke was the chosen one. Now, the canon book Skywalker, A Family at War acts as a biography of the whole Skywalker family, and it really explains this in a great way that I enjoy personally. That's why I wanted to make this video and share it with you guys. But I think it's so interesting the way that this book ties it into Obi-Wan's thinking in A New Hope. And obviously that's retroactive lore, you might even call it a retcon, even though I don't think it's necessarily a retcon because it doesn't change anything, it just adds to the story. A big part of the OT comes from Obi-Wan and Yoda instructing Luke, and they are very adamant that Luke needs to kill Vader and the Emperor. They keep telling him that his final trial, his final test before he becomes a Jedi is to face Vader a second time after the Empire Strikes Back. And Luke interprets that as them wanting him to kill his own father. That's a big part of the conversation that he has with Obi-Wan in Return of the Jedi. And if you remember, Luke says, "I can't kill my own father," and Obi-Wan says, "Then the Emperor has already won." So it seems like Obi-Wan really wanted Luke to kill Vader even after Luke knew that Anakin was Vader. That's really interesting because it shows that perhaps, in the new canon lore that's all connected, during the time of the original trilogy, Obi-Wan still believed that Luke was the chosen one, not Anakin. And that's even the case in Legends, because I have an older video I made about Obi-Wan's reaction to Anakin's redemption, and basically Obi-Wan says, as he's watching in the throne room in Return of the Jedi as a spirit, he says that he would not have believed this if he hadn't seen it for himself. Like, he thought that Anakin was completely gone, truly dead, it was only Vader, and he could never be redeemed. So he thought that Luke was the one who was going to bring balance to the Force, and he was shocked when he saw Anakin return and destroy Palpatine and save Luke and everything. So that really connects very well. That's something I really enjoy, is that right up until the moment that Anakin was redeemed in Return of the Jedi and he saved Luke, Obi-Wan still believed that Luke was the chosen one. And I just find that very interesting. Obviously when the original trilogy was made, they hadn't introduced the chosen one prophecy. That storyline wasn't introduced by George yet. But regardless how you feel about the whole Chosen One prophecy and stuff, I think it's very interesting to connect that to Luke and see how maybe Obi-Wan thought that it was Luke. I find that very, very interesting. It'd be interesting to know what Yoda thought of the whole Chosen One prophecy. We know that in Legends, Vader said that the Chosen One was dead. He thought to himself that Anakin died in the Jedi Temple, but the Chosen One had died on Mustafar. That's a part of the lore from the Legends book, Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Vader, and I have some videos covering that as well, but I don't want to ramble on too much here. Thank you guys. Under the command of Master Yoda, Obi-Wan Kenobi brought Luke Skywalker to Tatooine, placing the infant under the care of his family. At the time, directly after the rise of the Empire, Obi-Wan believed that Anakin was dead, having burned alive on the shores of Mustafar after their duel. However, the Sith Lord Darth Vader was reborn as a cyborg warrior and unleashed upon the galaxy as an enforcer for the new Emperor. Obi-Wan wouldn't learn of Vader's survival until sometime later in both Legends and canon. What I'd like to go over in this video is Obi-Wan's reaction when he did learn that Vader was alive, and if he was worried that the Sith Lord would find his son Luke on Tatooine. I want to jump right into the very end of the Legends book Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Vader, which shows us how Obi-Wan learned that Vader was alive and what his immediate reaction was on Tatooine. At the very end of this book, we find Obi-Wan Kenobi inside Tashi Station at Anchorhead, a settlement that was close to Tatooine's western Dune Sea. Obi-Wan, now known locally as Ben, had taken possession of an abandoned home on a bluff in the Jundland Wastes. He glanced at the HoloNet news display in the cantina from time to time, but the focus of his interest was on a provisions store across the street from where he sat. In the months since he had arrived on Tatooine, his hair and beard had grown quickly, and his face and hands had tanned brown. With the cowl of his robe raised over his head, no one would have taken him for a former Jedi, let alone a master who had sat on the High Council. Months earlier, when he and Anakin had been in pursuit of clues they had hoped would lead them to Darth Sidious, Obi-Wan had told Anakin that he could think of far worse places to live than Tatooine, and he still felt that way. He took in stride the sand that had so irritated Anakin. Tatooine's double sunset skies were always a marvel to behold, and the isolation suited him. All the more because Anakin had been subverted by Palpatine and for a brief time had served this new Emperor. Given everything that had happened since, the one image Obi-Wan knew he would never be able to erase from his memory was that of Anakin, or Darth Vader as Sidious had dubbed him, kneeling in allegiance to the Dark Lord after having gone on a murderous spree inside the Jedi Temple. If there was a second image, it was of Anakin burning on the shores of Mustafar's lava rivers, cursing him. Had he been wrong to let Anakin die there? Could he have been redeemed as Padme had believed to her last breath? These were the questions that plagued him and pained him more deeply than he would ever have thought possible. And now, all these months later, here he was on Tatooine, Anakin's homeworld, watching over Anakin's infant son, Luke. It was Obi-Wan's only reason for living. Watching from afar at any rate, today was just as close as he had come to the child in weeks. Just across the street, Luke was with Owen and Beru, neither of them aware of Obi-Wan's presence in the cantina. Suddenly, a HoloNet news report caught his ear and he swung to the cantina's display. A band of Jedi had been killed on Kashyyyk, but what truly caught his attention was the garbled, static image of a warrior in all black armor. It was not possible that he had heard what he thought he heard. Panicked, Obi-Wan asked a nearby patron who the reporter had said that was, and the man replied, Darth Vader. Obi-Wan stood up in a daze, knocking over his table, muttering to himself that Vader was alive. He stumbled out into the harsh sunlight of Anchorhead's principal street. He moved in a daze that had little to do with the glare or the heat. As impossible as it seemed, Anakin had survived Mustafar and resumed the Sith title of Darth Vader. How could Obi-Wan have been so foolish as to bring Luke to Tatooine of all places? Anakin's homeworld, the grave of his mother, the home of his only family members. Obi-Wan gripped his lightsaber under his robe, his mind whirling with questions. Had he driven Anakin deeper into the dark side by abandoning him on Mustafar? Could he face Anakin again? Could he kill him this time? From the far side of the street, he followed Owen and Beru as they moved with Luke. Should he warn them about Vader? Should he take Luke from them and hide on an even more remote world in the Outer Rim? His fear began to mount as his and Yoda's hopes for the future were dashed, just as the Chosen One had dashed the Jedi's hopes of bringing balance to the Force. Suddenly, he heard a voice that he had not heard in years, speaking to him not through his ears but directly into his thoughts. It was Qui-Gon. Seeking guidance from his former master, Obi-Wan asked if Darth Vader was truly Anakin. Qui-Gon replied that he was, but the Anakin they knew was imprisoned by the dark side of the Force. He told Obi-Wan that the Force would determine Anakin's future, and that Luke should not be told that Vader was his father until the time was right. Still worried for Luke's safety on Tatooine, Obi-Wan asked Qui-Gon if he should hide Luke somewhere else. Qui-Gon replied that the core of Anakin that resided inside Darth Vader knew that Tatooine was the source of nearly everything that caused him pain. According to Qui-Gon, Vader would never set foot on Tatooine, if only out of fear of reawakening Anakin. Obi-Wan realized that his obligation to Luke was unchanged, and he began to relax. Qui-Gon's voice began to fade back into the netherworld of the Force, and Obi-Wan's fears began to dissipate, replaced by renewed expectation. So, guys, I love this story. I love this book, Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Vader, and this little epilogue, it's technically the last chapter in the book, really pairs up well with the Legends Kenobi book. It's really what I was hoping the Kenobi show on Disney Plus would be like. I love Obi-Wan dealing with the trauma of Darth Vader and Anakin. I love that that was touched on in the show, but I really like how it's described in this book. And I love hearing Qui-Gon talk about Anakin being Vader. That's something that I was really hoping we would get in the show, and I think they missed on that. I think maybe they were trying to set up a season 2 and then it just fell through or hasn't been announced yet. But having Qui-Gon appear right at the end was cool. I was just hoping maybe he would guide Obi-Wan through the show, even if it's just his voice talking about stuff. Anyway, I love Qui-Gon giving Obi-Wan reassurance about Luke being safe on Tatooine, because, you know, that's kind of something that people always joke about, is like, why would they send Luke to live with the Lars family, like literally the only sort of relatives that Darth Vader and Anakin had at all. And, you know, Yoda's logic was that he believed the Jedi were wrong for taking Force-sensitive children from their family and raising them in the temple. After Order 66 and the fall of the Jedi, he realized that young children, even if they're Force sensitive, should be with their family and grow up in a loving environment. So that's why he told Obi-Wan to take Luke to Tatooine to live with Owen and Beru. That's explained in the Revenge of the Sith novelization. So when you think of it like that, they're basically biding their time, Obi-Wan and Yoda. They're waiting for Luke and Leia to grow up, and Leia goes with Bail Organa, Luke goes to the Lars family. So that way they're separated, but they're both in the environment that Yoda thinks that they should be in. And, you could argue that Luke became the person he was because he grew up with Owen and Beru and he wasn't trained from birth to be a Jedi by Obi-Wan. But I am still in the camp saying that would be awesome if Obi-Wan just trained Luke from birth and he was like the most powerful Jedi of all time by the time of the events of the original trilogy. But anyway, yes, I love this story. I love these details. I love this book. I definitely recommend reading Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Vader if you haven't. It picks up about Vader right after Revenge of the Sith. And check out the Legends Kenobi book too. It's really like what the show should have been. It's a smaller story on Tatooine, and it's all about Obi-Wan and the Tusken Raiders and farmers and stuff, and it's actually really good. But thank you guys so much for watching. Obi-Wan Kenobi served as Luke Skywalker's first master, introducing the young boy to the Force and the ways of the Jedi. In canon, after sacrificing himself on the Death Star, Obi-Wan appeared to Yoda as a Force ghost, asking the old Grand Master to train Luke as his final Padawan. While Yoda was initially reluctant, Obi-Wan insisted that Luke would redeem the Jedi, and was the only one who could confront the Sith. During Luke's training with Yoda, Obi-Wan was always watching from the netherworld of the Force, pondering not only Luke's flaws and obstacles, but Anakin's as well. In the canon book, The Empire Strikes Back from a Certain Point of View, there is an entire story from Obi-Wan's perspective, revealing his thoughts on Luke's training and what was going through his mind as Luke foolishly rushed to save his friends on Bespin. I had hoped that dying would be enough to untangle me from the Skywalker family's issues, and yet here I am again, Obi-Wan Kenobi, one with the Force and still the only thing standing between a Skywalker and an impulsive decision that could have galactic consequences. Tatooine had by no means been a glamorous locale for exile, though I had no choice but to settle myself near Luke's new guardians. Yoda, however, with an entire galaxy at his fingertips, had been so determined to make a meal of his martyrdom that he chose Dagobah as his refuge, the only planet that smells worse than the Jedi Temple training rooms after a combat class with 14-year-olds. Death is better than Dagobah, I think, as the swamp world crystallizes around me. I'm shocked Luke stayed this long. If it were Anakin sent here, with minimal instructions delivered to him by a ghost, only to see his ship swallowed by a sinkhole, Yoda cracking his droid on the dome, then deeming him unteachable before they'd had a chance to talk about anything beyond Yoda's terrible cooking, he would have been grinding his teeth in that way that used to drive me mad. All that, plus the low ceilings, the perpetual damp, and snakes in places they had no business being. The moment the rain started, Anakin would have stormed out of the hut loudly reciting an itemized list of frustrations to no one in particular. If he'd been unable to get his X-Wing out of the swamp, I have no doubt Anakin would have found a way to walk off the planet. But Luke had stayed, and Master Yoda had taught him. And I only had to appear to Yoda in half a dozen of his dreams to convince him that Luke was not Anakin, and this time would be different. We are all better than we had been before. Or not better, but at least we knew what not to do when it comes to training chosen ones. Through the swampy mist rising off the soil, I see Luke throwing supplies into the cargo bay of his X-Wing, hasty and disorganized, shouting over his shoulder at Yoda. I seem to have arrived mid-rant, and though Luke has yet to notice me, I doubt my presence would have done much to quell his passion. Anakin never held his tongue around his elders. The Skywalkers are wildfires, their passions scorching the dirt as soon as they're given a spark. Even Leia was already well known for her ability to set the Empire on fire with nothing but a wet match. Relentless was the word Bail had most often used when he had sent me reports about her. Her mother would have been proud. Luke shouts about his friends as he darts nimbly around the edge of his X-Wing to fiddle with the control panel in the cockpit. His orange flight suit looks garish amid the greens and browns of the swamp, a smudge of flame in the gloom. From his perch atop the ship, R2-D2 whistles his ascent, ever the instigator. "I've got to help them," Luke says. "You must not go," Yoda replies. He's huddled on the ground beneath the nose of the X-Wing, and though I have only ever known a stooped, slow-moving Yoda, somehow he seems even shakier on his feet than the last time I was here. He's leaning heavily on his gnarled cane as it sinks into the mud, his posture the curled crook of a being who has become too accustomed to living in darkness. "But Han and Leia will die if I don't," Luke replies ferociously, dropping off the ladder of his starfighter. Since no one is pointing out the obvious flaw in that logic, I feel the need to finally intervene. "You don't know that," I say dryly. Luke doesn't look surprised as he turns to me. This isn't the first time I've had to make an appearance here to facilitate a group therapy session with him and Yoda. His hair has gotten longer since I last saw him, and it falls over the scars that have rearranged one side of his face since the Wampa attack. I had hoped that death and time and oneness with the Force might take the edge off the strangeness of seeing Anakin's eyes in his son's face. But now, as they blaze with the same determination I saw so many times in life, it overwhelms me. I had spent years and years in that tiny sand cell on Tatooine, sweating and perpetually dehydrated and with nothing to do but relive everything I could have done differently and then slowly let each one go, trying to make peace with losing Anakin. But the shades of him in his son's face catapult me back in time, and all the years I spent by Anakin's side, fighting and teaching and laughing and arguing and nearly dying and saving each other over and over again, spill out across my mind. And now here is his son, looking at me with those same flushed cheeks, caring too much about everything, and both my life and death would be so much easier if the Skywalkers didn't care so much. How different this galaxy would be if the Skywalkers didn't care so much. It isn't about Anakin anymore, I remind myself, struggling to return to the present moment. It's about Luke, and not letting him make the same mistakes his father and I did. Why even in death must I chide myself to focus on now and here, like I'm a Padawan struggling to sit still? Even Yoda cannot see their fate, I say. But I can help them, Luke protests. I feel the Force. But you cannot control it. In his early days of training, Anakin had always been so tentative in speaking about the Force, like it was a word in a foreign language whose meaning he still wasn't entirely sure of. With Luke, there's no hesitation, even though the concept was only introduced to him a few years earlier. Now, when he needs a reason to go, the Force is telling him exactly what to do, like it's a guidebook I'd been recommending to him. That's not how the Force works, I think, and resist the urge to rub my temples, a habit Anakin had always teased me about. Luke turns away, shoving a hand through his hair. I look to Yoda with a silent plea to back me up, but he seems to have taken my arrival as an invitation to move into the back seat of this teaching moment. This is a dangerous time for you, I say to Luke, when you will be tempted by the dark side of the Force. Yoda suddenly seems to remember that he's the only living authority figure here, and he pipes up. Yes, yes, to Obi-Wan you listen. The cave. Remember your failure at the cave. I don't know what cave he refers to, but I don't ask. I don't need another reason to doubt Luke. I had always doubted Anakin, and he had felt that wobble in our foundation from the start. Add it to the list of mistakes I was trying not to make again. But I've learned so much since then, Luke protests, and I resist the urge to snort. As though carrying Yoda on your shoulders and eating his terrible cooking for a few weeks makes you a Jedi. Master Yoda, I promise to return and finish what I've begun. You have my word. Why did I come? I lost this fight before it even began. Anakin never learned how to back down from an argument, even if he had definitely been proved wrong. Why did I think Luke should be any different? You can't keep a promise if you're dead, Luke, I want to say. And you'll be dead if you go because it is clear to everyone here but you that this is a trap. Which I can't say because you're your father's stubborn son, and it will only make you want to argue more. The Skywalkers don't listen. Every argument I ever had with Anakin, it felt like he was fighting with a version of me in his head rather than actually confronting the things I was saying. The Skywalkers could level planets with their obstinacy. Instead, I say, it is you and your abilities the Emperor wants, which is as close to the truth as I can creep without telling him who passed those abilities onto him. That is why your friends are made to suffer. And that is why I have to go, Luke replies. I blink several times, waiting for him to realize how little sense that argument makes. He doesn't. Luke turns back to his X-Wing, swinging the door to the cargo bay shut, and frustration wells inside me. It's a struggle to tamp it down. I am still a Jedi. I am still in control of myself and my feelings, but I never had a hold on my own heart when it came to Anakin. That was part of his undoing. Luke, I call as he mounts the ladder leading to the cockpit. Desperation splits my voice. How is it I have dealt with this family for generations and still haven't figured out how to get through to them? I don't want to lose you to the Emperor the way I lost. I fumble. What I want to say is Anakin. What I want to say is my best friend. What I want to say is your father, the way we both lost him. To a needless war, to a wild heart, to a doomed prophecy. Instead, I finish Vader. Luke turns back to me, and there it is again, the wild glint in his eyes. There is Anakin. You won't, Luke says. Stopped they must be. Yoda is starting to sound frustrated, which is a testament to just how infuriating Luke is. Even Anakin rarely cracked Master Yoda. On this all depends. Only a fully trained Jedi Knight with the Force as his ally will conquer Vader and the Emperor. If you end your training now, if you choose the quick and easy path as Vader did, you will become an agent of evil. I glance down at Yoda, resisting the urge to argue. A divided front won't do us any good in persuading Luke to listen, but I want to point out that Anakin's path was never easy. I don't know why I am defending Anakin, even in my own head, especially after he killed me. Luke looks between us, his eyes suddenly pleading. He wants to go, but more than that, he wants us to tell him he's right, that he's doing the right thing. The Skywalkers always want to do the right thing. It's what gets them every time. All I say is patience. And sacrifice Han and Leia, Luke shoots back. If you honor what they fight for, Yoda replies, yes. Luke's face sets, and then he turns away from us. His hand is strangling the struts of the ladder leading up to the cockpit. If you choose to face Vader, I say, you will do it alone. I cannot interfere. I say it mostly in the hope it will scare him into staying. He's never truly fought alone before. He's never been alone before. He hardly knows Han and Leia, and doesn't yet know who Leia is to him, and already his heart has put down deep roots, just like his father. With Anakin, it was his mother, then Qui-Gon and me, and Ahsoka and Padme. Childhood abandonment resulting in him clinging with white knuckles to whoever was nearest him. Luke presses his forehead against the ladder, and I think for a moment I've scared him enough that he'll stay. But then he says quietly, I understand. He turns back to us just for a moment, and there he is again, the son of my friend who could never be talked out of anything he set his mind to. R2, Luke calls as he mounts the ladder, fire up the converters. Luke, I call, one last attempt, but when he turns back to me, the words die in my throat. Everything I want to say to him suddenly feels hollow and untrue. The language of the Jedi that I had spouted for years, first to Anakin, now to his son. For every way the Council had broken Anakin down, I had stood by and let them. I had been their arbiter of justice, repeating the language they had given me. Why didn't I fight for Anakin, I think. So instead, I offer the only advice I have. Don't give in to hate. That leads to the dark side. Strong is Vader, Yoda adds. Mind what you have learned. Save you it can. Luke tugs the strap of his helmet into place. I will, he says, and I'll return. I promise. If only those were the sort of promises we could keep, I think. The cockpit of the X-Wing closes with a pneumatic hiss, and the swamp debris beneath it is blown aside as the engines fire. The starfighter lifts off, casting Yoda and I into darkness. Told you I did, Yoda murmurs, his face to the sky, and I wonder if he resents ghosts like me for arriving without warning. Reckless is he. Now, matters are worse. That boy is our last hope, I say. And in my voice, I hear every Jedi before me who brought us here, dead and desperate and up to our knees in a swamp. But Yoda shakes his head. No, there is another. And it's a long, quiet moment between us before I remind myself it isn't Anakin. He's not here anymore, and neither am I. While in exile on Tatooine, Obi-Wan Kenobi did his best to avoid drawing attention to himself as he quietly watched over the young Luke Skywalker. However, he did struggle with inactivity and ignoring the duties of a Jedi. Since Tatooine was a pretty rough place and was under the control of Jabba the Hutt, there were times over the years when Obi-Wan was forced into action. During the time of the Great Drought, Obi-Wan had to rescue Luke from Jabba's thugs, after the young boy had tried to stop them from taking water taxes from the moisture farmers. However, Obi-Wan's actions would later have violent consequences. The story I want to jump into today comes from the canon 2015 Star Wars comic series, in the Journals of Obi-Wan Kenobi arc, telling stories from his years on Tatooine. Unfortunately, Obi-Wan found himself face to face with the Wookiee bounty hunter Krrsantan, and to say that the Jedi Master was out of practice would be an understatement. A year after the Great Drought and his run-in with Jabba's thugs, Obi-Wan was doing his best to return to the life of a hermit, since Jabba was still desperate to find the mystery man that had attacked his men. Obi-Wan began to work for the Jawas, defending them from Tuskens, and he had the Jawas give Luke parts to fix his T-16 Skyhopper after Luke had crashed it in Beggar's Canyon. Obi-Wan did this because he felt that there would be a day that Luke would need to fend for himself and he'd need a speeder of his own to fly away with. However, an infuriated Uncle Owen returned the parts, saying that he knew Obi-Wan had been watching over their farm ever since he brought Luke to them. He mentioned that the Lars farm was the only homestead that hadn't been attacked by Tuskens for years, and now Jawas were giving them stuff for free, so he knew that Obi-Wan was behind it all. He told Obi-Wan to stay away from Luke and that they did not want his help. Meanwhile, Jabba the Hutt hired Krrsantan to find the man who ambushed his water tax collectors. Jabba's thugs showed the Wookiee where the incident had happened, explaining that no one saw anything or who did it. Krrsantan noticed that the Lars farm was nearby, and he went there. Inside, he abducted Uncle Owen, assuming that he had some connection to the mysterious man he was hunting. Luke had run away from home, but he felt a kind of disturbance, a feeling, and ran back to the farm, where he found Aunt Beru. She told him that some creature had taken Owen and headed for the canyons, and she instructed Luke to hide in the maintenance bay. On a cliff, Krrsantan shocked Uncle Owen to make him scream, which of course drew Obi-Wan's attention immediately. He was meditating in the Dune Sea when he felt a disturbance in the Force. Standing atop the cliff face to face with Krrsantan, Obi-Wan tried to slow his breathing to hide how tired he was from the climb. Looking at the Wookiee, he felt fear in his gut and felt that the pain had gotten worse with age. Obi-Wan said that he knew who Krrsantan was, and he guessed correctly that Jabba had hired him. He tried to use a mind trick on the Wookiee to make him leave Tatooine, but it didn't work, and Krrsantan sent him flying. When Obi-Wan tried to reach for his lightsaber, the Wookiee took a giant bite out of his arm. Krrsantan held him over the edge of the cliff by the throat, but threw him back down, and Obi-Wan assumed that he was worth more alive, which is why Chrysanthemum wouldn't kill him. He trapped Obi-Wan under an electrified net, and when Owen tried to help, Chrysanthemum sent him flying off the edge where he clung to the rocks. In pain, being electrocuted by the net, Obi-Wan reached out with the Force and begged Qui-Gon's spirit to guide his hand. He blinded Chrysanthemum with dust and sand, then broke free of the net and stacked large rocks on top of Chrysanthemum with the Force. But when he tried to reach Owen, he turned to see Chrysanthemum enraged, holding one of the boulders over his head. Igniting his lightsaber, wondering if he was still enough of a Jedi to stop him, Obi-Wan somersaulted over the Wookiee and slashed the boulder in two, also leaving a long scar across Chrysanthemum's left eye. At the same time, the small spire of rock that Owen was clinging to broke, and he began to fall. Obi-Wan attempted to hold him in place with the Force and guide him back to the rocks even as Chrysanthemum continued to fight him. With one hand holding Owen, he tried to hold the Wookiee off, but he lost his concentration and thus his hold through the Force. Owen began to fall to his death, but out of nowhere Luke appeared, flying his Skyhopper and caught him out of the air. As they flew away, Obi-Wan thought to himself that he could feel the Force flowing through Luke in that moment, the boy who would one day save them all. With Owen out of danger, Obi-Wan turned to finish his fight with the Wookiee. He deflected Chrysanthemum's bowcaster shots back at him, causing him to scream in pain. Chrysanthemum backed up, still partially blinded and now freshly wounded, and he fell from the cliff. Down below, Luke and Owen hugged each other as Obi-Wan watched. Obi-Wan later wrote that he heard Chrysanthemum had fled Tatooine since he failed Jabba. Obi-Wan and Owen did not say anything to each other about what had happened. They simply returned to their daily lives. So guys, I really like this story. I like this little run in the comics where it's just Obi-Wan's journals and he's talking about how sometimes he still had to jump into action on Tatooine. Honestly, stories like this are what I wished the Obi-Wan show would be like, where he's on Tatooine, he's doing stuff, he's protecting Luke. It's much more of like a small scale, small conflict, just him protecting Owen and Beru and Luke and stuff. I really like stories like that. These stories in this comic remind me of the Legends Kenobi book, where it's a much smaller conflict. He stays on Tatooine, and it's just about him kind of trying to mediate a war between the Tusken Raiders and all of the moisture farmers. And he thinks about Luke, and there's a lot of stuff about Anakin, and Obi-Wan's processing what happened after Revenge of the Sith. But it's just him on Tatooine, still being a hermit, but he is forced into action and he has to fight sometimes. And I don't want to give away everything that happens in the book, but it's a great book, and that's really what I wish the Obi-Wan Kenobi show was like. I think him leaving Tatooine in that show and like fighting Vader again, you know, whatever. I love that duel. I don't really have a problem with that, but I just think that there was too much going on. I didn't like how Reva went to the farm and stuff like that. I think that a Wookiee bounty hunter, you know, stuff like that is much more appropriate because it doesn't really expose Luke to the Jedi and Sith and the Force and stuff. So that's what I like about this, because it's still action, but it doesn't really contradict anything about Obi-Wan's exile and Luke's childhood, I feel like, if that makes sense. I just think the stories that happened on those 19 years that Obi-Wan was on Tatooine should be a lot more like this. Tusken Raiders, Jawas, you know, bounty hunters, Jabba the Hutt, whatever. All stuff like that. That's awesome. I think that those are good areas of conflict for Obi-Wan to get into, and it makes sense that he's trying to be a hermit, he's trying to stay out of trouble, but sometimes he just can't because Tatooine is a very violent and difficult place to live. So that's all that I have to say about this. I really like this story, and I was excited. Hey guys, welcome back to another video, and I hope you're all doing well. Now, for those of you who don't know, Obi-Wan Kenobi is known as the master of Form 3 of lightsaber combat, also called Sorisu. Sorisu was the defensive form, and it's how Obi-Wan was able to defeat Anakin on Mustafar. The novelization of Revenge of the Sith describes Anakin's offensive Form 5 meeting Obi-Wan's defensive Form 3 as an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. However, while he did achieve mastery of Form 3, and it's what he is most known for, it wasn't always the form that he used. He actually didn't start studying it until he became a Jedi Knight, after the events of the Phantom Menace. Let's go back to Obi-Wan's days as the apprentice of Qui-Gon Jinn. Qui-Gon was very skilled in the fourth form of lightsaber combat, also known as Ataru, and he was considered one of the greatest masters of the form. As his Padawan, Obi-Wan also chose to use Ataru as his primary form. However, Ataru had glaring weaknesses and flaws due to the fact that it relied on large, sweeping strikes and exhausting acrobatics. Obi-Wan was able to effectively utilize the form due to his youth and stamina, which helped compensate for his lack of experience when he was still a young Padawan. Obi-Wan would rely on the acrobatics of Ataru to flank his opponents, which we saw in the duel against Darth Maul on Naboo. Obi-Wan preferred to use direct physical attacks, usually deciding not to use the open flourishes typical of Ataru and instead using direct slashes. So this may seem surprising that Obi-Wan was actually using Ataru while he was a Padawan, so until he was 25 years old. However, this all changed after the death of Qui-Gon on Naboo. As I said before, Qui-Gon was a master of Ataru, but the form did have its weaknesses. These flaws in the form are what led to Qui-Gon's defeat at the hands of Darth Maul. Due to his age, Qui-Gon became incredibly fatigued as the duel progressed, and Maul was very familiar with the weaknesses of Ataru, specifically the gaps in the form's defense. Due to the large flourishes it required, Ataru left the chest and torso relatively unprotected. As Qui-Gon pushed Maul into the confined space of the melting pit, Maul knew that the smaller area would have a detrimental effect on Qui-Gon's use of Ataru. Eventually, after pushing Qui-Gon onto the defensive, Maul of course impaled him through the torso, mortally wounding him. Obviously, Obi-Wan was devastated to see his master fall, and he would later blame Qui-Gon's death on the weaknesses of Ataru, which is why he abandoned it as his primary form. The defensive weaknesses of Ataru prompted Obi-Wan to begin studying Form 3, Sorisu. Sorisu relied on very tight blade work to provide maximum defensive coverage, and this strong defensive technique would allow the user to essentially outlast an opponent until they began to make mistakes. This is exactly what Obi-Wan did to Anakin on Mustafar. Obi-Wan was able to use his defense long enough until Anakin made the mistake of trying to jump over him on the lava bank. By studying Sorisu, Obi-Wan intended to create a hybrid form between it and Ataru to compensate for Ataru's flaws, in honor of Qui-Gon. Sorisu became his new primary form, and he had become the absolute master of the form by the end of the Clone Wars. Even Mace Windu considered him to be the master of Sorisu. Obviously, the form served him well as he was able to defeat some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, with his most impressive victory by far being against Anakin on Mustafar. After their legendary duel on Mustafar, Obi-Wan assumed that Anakin Skywalker, then the Sith Lord Darth Vader, had died from his severe injuries. And during his exile on Tatooine, Obi-Wan mourned the loss of his student and brother, carrying tremendous guilt. Of course, Vader had survived, holding on to life through his hatred and living within a suit of life support armor. The story of Obi-Wan discovering that Vader was still alive was recently retold in canon in the Obi-Wan Kenobi show. The third sister just tells Obi-Wan that Vader is alive and he is left shocked by the revelation. However, in my opinion, the Legends version of this story, told in the novel Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader, is much better and more emotional. Several months after arriving on Tatooine, Obi-Wan visited Tashi Station in Anchorhead. The station served the nearby moisture farms and even had a hyperwave repeater, which played the HoloNet news from Naboo, Rhodia, and sometimes Nal Hutta. Obi-Wan glanced at the HoloNet feed from time to time, but did not pay full attention to it. As he sat in the station, he thought of Tatooine, of its gossiping residents who had no idea that he was once a Jedi Master. He remembered once telling Anakin, as they searched for clues regarding the elusive Darth Sidious near the end of the war, that he could imagine worse places to live than Tatooine. He still felt that way. He did not mind the perpetual sand that Anakin hated, and the binary sunset of Tatooine was beautiful to behold, and he felt as though the isolation suited him now. Especially because Anakin had been subverted by Darth Sidious, and served the newly appointed Emperor for a short time. Obi-Wan thought of that day, and he knew the one image he would never be able to forget was that of Anakin as Darth Vader, kneeling before the Emperor after his slaughter in the Jedi Temple. If there was a second image, it was that of Anakin burning on one of Mustafar's lava banks. Obi-Wan wondered if he had been wrong to let Anakin die there, and if Anakin truly could have been redeemed, as Padme had believed until her dying breath. The questions plagued him and pained him more deeply than he ever thought possible. And now, months later, he was back on Anakin's homeworld, watching over Anakin's son, Luke. It was Obi-Wan's only reason for living. As he sipped his water, a HoloNet report caught his ear, as the reporter spoke of a band of Jedi survivors that had been defeated on Kashyyyk. Obi-Wan cursed under his breath and mourned the loss of the foolish Jedi. They had no idea the real truth of the war, and they had continued their fight. Suddenly, the image on the HoloNet showed a dark warrior, clad head to toe in black armor. Obi-Wan seemed to freeze and fill with dread, and he thought surely he had misheard what the reporter just said. Jumping from his seat, he asked the bartender what name the reporter had just said. Nonchalant, the worker replied that she had said Lord Vader. Obi-Wan replied that was impossible, and overcome with shock, grabbed his belongings and stumbled out into the street. He moved in a daze that had nothing to do with the bright glare of the suns or the heat. As impossible as it seemed, Anakin had survived Mustafar and resumed his title as the Sith Lord Darth Vader. Obi-Wan wondered how he could have been so foolish as to listen to Yoda and bring Luke to Tatooine of all worlds, Anakin's homeworld, the home of his closest family and the site of his mother's grave. Obi-Wan tightly gripped his lightsaber, hidden beneath his robes. He thought many questions to himself. Had he pushed Anakin closer to the dark side by abandoning him on Mustafar? Could he face Anakin again? Could he kill him this time? Should he warn Owen and Beru about Darth Vader? Should he take Luke from them and flee to another world that was even more remote than Tatooine? His fear began to grow, and he thought that he and Yoda's hopes for the future had just been destroyed, when he heard a familiar voice call out to him. He came to an abrupt halt. It was a voice he had not heard through his ears, but directly into his thoughts. It was Qui-Gon.
Master, I was wrong to leave him on the lava bank. I should have made sure that he was dead.
Obi-Wan, the Anakin that you and I knew is imprisoned by the dark side. The Force will determine his future, but Luke must not be told that Vader is his father until the time is right.
Should I take further steps to hide Luke?
The core of Anakin that resides in Vader grasps that Tatooine is the source of nearly everything that causes him pain. Vader will never set foot on Tatooine, if only out of fear of reawakening Anakin.
Qui-Gon's voice began to fade, and Obi-Wan's fears began to dissipate, replaced by renewed expectation. His obligation to Luke remained unchanged, and he went forward, trusting in the Force. As Obi-Wan and Yoda made their way out of the Jedi Temple after recalibrating the beacon, warning survivors to stay away, Obi-Wan was compelled to uncover the truth of the slaughter around them. While he maintained that he needed to find out who had led the attack, Yoda insisted that he already knew the truth, and he would only find pain if he looked further. In the film, the scene is somewhat brief, but the novelization greatly expands upon Obi-Wan's thoughts and emotions, and it's heartbreaking. After altering the beacon, Obi-Wan decided that he needed to know everything. He had to find out what exactly he was warning the surviving Jedi against. Perhaps deep down he did already know the answer, but he told Yoda that knowing was one thing and seeing was another. When Yoda warned him that to see it would bring him pain, Obi-Wan was not deterred, replying that it would be pain he had earned and he would not hide from it. He said that he was not afraid to see, and Yoda replied that he should be. Obi-Wan keyed a code that brought up a holoscan of a chamber in the temple known as the Room of 1,000 Fountains. He watched younglings run into the room, fleeing a storm of blaster fire. He watched Sin Dralig and a pair of teenage Padawans back into the scene, blades whirling, cutting down advancing clone troopers. He watched a lightsaber blade come into view, cutting down first one Padawan and then another. He watched the brisk stride of a caped figure who hacked through Dralig's shoulder, then stood aside as the old Jedi fell dying to let the rest of the clones blast the children to shreds. Obi-Wan's expression never flickered. He opened himself to what he was about to see. He was prepared, centered, and trusting in the Force, and yet, when the caped man turned to meet a cloaked figure behind him, Obi-Wan wished he had the strength to rip his eyes out of his head. But even if he was blind, he would see that image forever. He would see his friend, his student, his brother, turn and kneel in front of a Lord of the Sith. Fumbling nervously, he managed to shut down the holoscan. His knees buckled and he fell to the floor, where he huddled there, blind with pain.
I should have let them shoot me. No, that was already too late. It was already too late at Geonosis. Darth Maul on Naboo. I should have died there, before I ever brought Anakin here.
Yoda was not sympathetic, and he chastised Obi-Wan, ordering him to cease that line of thought. He said that no one could make a Jedi fall, even Darth Sidious. Anakin had chosen that path himself. When Obi-Wan said that he might know why Anakin did, Yoda rebuked that why didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that there were now 2 Sith and 2 Jedi to face them. Obi-Wan replied that Palpatine had faced Mace Windu, Aegon Kolar, Saesee Tiin, and Kit Fisto, 4 of the greatest swordsmen ever produced by the Jedi Order, by himself. He told Yoda that even both of them together would not have a chance if they confronted Palpatine. Yoda agreed, but said that if they split up, they might be able to create a chance. Thanks to the teachings of Qui-Gon Jinn, Obi-Wan Kenobi became one with the Force after his death. Where he had once been but an isolated drop of water in a great sea, he was now the sea itself, flowing everywhere and through everything. The Force transcended time and space. As a spiritual entity, Obi-Wan was not hampered by the laws of physics. He could travel across the galaxy from one world to another by merely thinking of the journey. As such, Obi-Wan silently witnessed Luke Skywalker's confrontation against Darth Vader and the Emperor, and his thoughts throughout the shocking ordeal are explained in the Legends book The Life and Legend of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Obi-Wan's spirit was invisible but present when Luke arrived in the Endor system. When Luke surrendered to Darth Vader, he listened as Luke maintained his belief that a remnant of Anakin Skywalker remained within Vader and had not been entirely consumed by evil. Luke urged his father to let go of his hatred. As Vader rejected his son's pleas, causing Luke to state that his father must truly be dead, Obi-Wan wished that he had been able to convince Luke of that sooner. After Vader delivered Luke to the Emperor's throne room on the second Death Star, and the Emperor orchestrated a lightsaber duel to test father against son, Obi-Wan became even more resolved that Luke had been unprepared for the confrontation. He thought to himself that Luke was too afraid of what might happen to Leia if he could not defeat Vader. Obi-Wan believed that the only outcome must be Vader's death at Luke's hand. But when Luke finally did manage to disarm and subdue Vader, Obi-Wan's spirit watched with dread as the Emperor encouraged the young Skywalker to destroy his father and join the dark side. He feared that he was about to lose Luke the same way that he had lost Anakin. However, Luke refused the Emperor's machinations, denouncing the dark side and proclaiming himself a Jedi. Obi-Wan watched as the Emperor raised his gnarled fingers and unleashed bolts of blue lightning onto Luke, and Vader struggled to his master's side as Luke begged his father for help. Obi-Wan knew that Vader would never help, and he felt overwhelmed with anguish. Luke would soon be dead, and Vader would simply remain the Emperor's puppet. In fact, Obi-Wan was so convinced of Vader's nature that he was stunned by what happened next. Vader grabbed the Emperor, forcing the deadly lightning to fall away from Luke and crash down upon both Sith Lords. Vader carried his master across the room and hurled him down into the reactor shaft. A moment later, the Emperor exploded in a great release of dark energy. Had Obi-Wan's spirit not witnessed Vader's action, he never would have believed it. Vader, the same monster that Obi-Wan had left to die on Mustafar, had sacrificed himself to save his son. And suddenly Obi-Wan realized where he had failed. For unlike Luke, Obi-Wan had not only believed that Anakin was completely consumed by the dark side, but actually refused to believe that any goodness could have remained within Vader. And by refusing to allow that possibility, he had condemned not only his friend and former apprentice, but his own capacity for hope. Fortunately, Obi-Wan thought, Luke's unwavering faith in his father's innate goodness had proved to be a stronger force than the power of the dark side. Obi-Wan realized that he had never been ready to forgive Anakin, and that Anakin would never be free until he did. He knew that Anakin would not be alive for much longer, and as Luke carried his father's body through the Death Star, Obi-Wan shifted his psyche to another realm and waited. After Anakin died in his son's arms, Obi-Wan called out his name into the void. Anakin's voice replied, immediately saying how sorry he was for what he had done. Obi-Wan interrupted him, explaining that he was now within the netherworld of the Force, and that if he ever wished to return to the world of the living, he needed to listen before his consciousness faded. Obi-Wan sensed confusion and remorse in Anakin's psyche, and Anakin asked why Obi-Wan would teach him the way to immortality after everything he had done. Obi-Wan replied that he would do so because Anakin ended the horror of the Sith, fulfilling the prophecy as the chosen one of the Force, and because he was wrong about Anakin and they were friends. Anakin thanked Obi-Wan for his forgiveness, calling him Master once more. After the fall of the Republic and the death of Padme Amidala, the Skywalker twins were hidden from their father, Darth Vader, and his Sith Master, Emperor Palpatine. Obi-Wan Kenobi would spend the next 19 years in exile as Luke Skywalker's guardian on Tatooine. Obviously, Obi-Wan is known for bending the truth, sharing information from a certain point of view. When the time came for Luke to learn of the Jedi and the Force, as well as the truth about the Jedi that his father Anakin had once been, Obi-Wan withheld crucial details, avoiding the dark secret that Anakin had become Darth Vader. In the canon book Skywalker: A Family at War, Obi-Wan's reasoning for lying to Luke is explained, giving insight into his thoughts and why he thought it was in Luke's best interest that he be kept in the dark. At this time, Luke knew virtually nothing about the Jedi Order and the Force. His uncle had always been brusque when Luke started asking questions. However, in Obi-Wan he found a welcoming presence, someone who seemed willing to help satisfy his fascination with the past and his curiosity about the galaxy. In his solitude, Obi-Wan had come to a realization, a phrase he was fond of repeating: "The truth is often what we make of it." Perhaps it was just his own spin on one of his master, Qui-Gon Jinn's, favorite truisms: "Your focus determines your reality." Now in his late 50s, Obi-Wan was finally beginning to feel like he'd grown out of his youthful foolishness. Nearly as gray-haired and wrinkled as Yoda himself, he had made peace with some of the Jedi Order's folly and come to a reckoning of sorts. In all those years, he had imagined what answers he might give to Luke's curious probing one day. In the safety of his hut, Obi-Wan told Luke only what he believed the young man needed to know, the most basic facts as he saw them. Their conversation laid the foundation for Luke's initiation into the ways of the Jedi, while Obi-Wan continued to protect him, shielding him from the darkest aspects of his heritage. This was in accordance with ancient Jedi teaching. Disclosing the shocking truth of Luke's parentage, a revelation worthy of a Jedi trial, was best delayed until he became a full-fledged Jedi Knight. Thus, instead of revealing the truth, that day Obi-Wan hailed the Jedi Knight Anakin Skywalker as the best star pilot in the galaxy, a cunning warrior, and a loyal friend. And to win Luke's confidence, Obi-Wan offered his own failure to win the young man's trust. He admitted serving as the master of the future Sith Lord Darth Vader before he turned to evil and became a Jedi hunter. Factually, both statements were true, but he dared not connect the two identities. Obi-Wan simply said that Vader had betrayed and murdered Luke's father. An important detail to also add to this is that at this time, according to this book, Obi-Wan believed that Luke was the chosen one, and that the prophecy was misread, never referring to Anakin. This is also hinted at in Rebels when Obi-Wan tells Maul that Luke is the chosen one. If Luke was the chosen one, Obi-Wan knew he would have to vanquish Vader to restore balance to the Force, which is another reason that he did not tell Luke that Vader was Anakin. Luke Skywalker's struggle with the dark side of the Force is one of the most important elements of his story in Return of the Jedi, as he stood between the light and dark on the cusp of becoming a Jedi Knight. From his all-black attire to his dark behavior, Luke was closer to the darkness than anyone realized. Anyone except Obi-Wan Kenobi. From the netherworld of the Force, realizing just how similar Luke was to Anakin, Obi-Wan was shocked to sense the darkness within Luke when he spoke to him on Dagobah. This is revealed in the canon book Return of the Jedi from a certain point of view, as Obi-Wan visited Luke a moment after Yoda's death. This wasn't Obi-Wan's first trip to Dagobah, but it pained him to think of the last time he had come here to speak to his student. As far as Obi-Wan had come, as much as he had seen, he still felt at a loss. What a fool he had been to think that he could train another impulsive, headstrong Skywalker. Ordinarily, learning to communicate with and use the Force was a process of discovery, but for Luke and his father before him, their passion, their sense of justice made them vulnerable to the dark side. That was why Obi-Wan had to find a way to effectively communicate with the young Luke. The stakes were impossibly high, and Obi-Wan sensed that Luke felt adrift at this moment. Through the Force, Obi-Wan could see the elderly Yoda inside his hut, with Luke at his side, both of them growing brightly, and he felt the planet gasp as Yoda joined the Force. Obi-Wan hesitated, unwilling to intrude on such a private moment. Already, this second attempt to reach Luke was spinning out of his control. Not only had Luke just watched his second Jedi Master die before his eyes, but Obi-Wan sensed that Yoda had told Luke the truth about his father. For so long, Obi-Wan had been sure that Luke should not learn the whole truth of Vader's identity until he had completed his Jedi training. For him to learn the truth so suddenly, so soon before his final test, could send him into the darkness. The danger was still there, But Obi-Wan also sensed an openness, a waiting inside his student, even as grief and loneliness washed through him. Approaching the hut, hearing the anguish in Luke's voice, Obi-Wan found his words easily through the will of the Force. "Yoda will always be with you," he said. Luke's head turned instantly. "Obi-Wan." Obi-Wan approached as Luke ducked beneath his X-Wing and crossed to meet him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, urgency and worry, even fear tinging his voice. For a moment, it was as if Anakin stood before him, returned from darkness, from death. "You told me Vader betrayed and murdered my father." Now Obi-Wan thought of his last meeting with Leia, the risk he'd taken in telling her even a little about her parents. "Your father was seduced by the dark side of the Force," Obi-Wan said. "He ceased to be Anakin Skywalker and became Darth Vader. When that happened, the good man who was your father was destroyed. So what I told you was true," Obi-Wan continued, from a certain point of view. Obi-Wan sensed the struggle within Luke's heart. Beneath a layer of calm lay a roiling sea of surging emotion. Darkness and light intertwined. Luke's darkness surged against the light, but his better nature, while quieter, was the more powerful of the two, for now. Of course, this was not the first time Luke had struggled so. Before, it had been attachment to his friends that threatened to pull him in the wrong direction, even after Obi-Wan warned him. Luke's voice broke. From a certain point of view? The last time he'd spoken to Luke, Obi-Wan's voice had sounded hollow and brittle in his own ghostly ears. He could read in Luke's posture that his decision to leave Dagobah and risk everything to save his friends had already been made. It was maddening how like his father he looked, with his high cheeks and shining blue eyes. During the Clone Wars, Anakin had risked his own life over and over to save his friends. "When I first knew him, your father was already a great pilot, but I was amazed how strongly the Force was with him. I took it upon myself to train him as a Jedi. I thought I could instruct him just as well as Yoda. I was wrong." "There is still good in him," Luke said. It was the last thing Obi-Wan expected to hear. These were the last words Padme had said to him, and to hear them now from her son made Obi-Wan feel as if, for all that he had joined the Force and become one with the Infinite, part of him could still feel small and shocked. How to explain to the young man that it mattered little, if at all, whether there were shards of Anakin's true and noble heart buried deep beneath the rotten, scabrous surface of Darth Vader? He worshipped power and desolation, committed himself to spreading darkness throughout the galaxy because he believed that what light there was could never triumph. "He's more machine now than man," Obi-Wan said, "twisted and evil." But he knew Luke wouldn't be convinced. Maybe this was the moment Obi-Wan had been waiting for. Maybe it was time he told Luke the truth. But how much of it? "I can't do it, Ben," Luke said with a shake of his head. "You can't escape your destiny," Obi-Wan said. Again, his voice sounded tinny and far off in his own ears. "You must face Darth Vader again." "I can't kill my own father." Those weren't the words Obi-Wan had expected to hear either. He'd expected, "I can't beat him," or "he's too powerful." Obi-Wan held Luke's gaze for a moment, then looked away with a sad shake of his head. "Then the Emperor has already won," he said. "You were our only hope." He was missing something vitally important. "Yoda spoke of another," Luke said. "Leia." Obi-Wan emptied his mind and let the Force shine through him. This was the crucial moment, his last chance to help Luke turn the tide. He wondered what he should say, was still wondering when he heard his own voice. "The other he spoke of was your twin sister." Luke's posture stiffened for a moment. A shock ran through him, and Obi-Wan could tell from the attitude of his body that the boy knew unvarnished truth when he heard it. Luke opened his mouth and shut it with a snap. Confusion knitted his brow. "But I have no sister." "To protect you both from the Emperor, you were hidden from your father when you were born. The Emperor understood, as I did, that if Anakin were to have any offspring, they would be a threat to him. That is the reason why your sister remains safely anonymous. Before his death, Obi-Wan had feared that, as strong in the Force as they both were, one or both of the twins would simply pluck the knowledge of their relation from thin air, especially if they spent a significant amount of time together. That's exactly what Luke did then. "Leia," he said. It wasn't a question. "Leia's my sister." Obi-Wan couldn't help but smile. "Your insight serves you well. Bury your feelings deep down, Luke. They do you credit, but they could be made to serve the Emperor." Luke hesitated only for a moment before sitting cross-legged beside Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan decided to share the truth of how Palpatine had defeated Anakin without a battle. Luke nodded slowly, taking in everything Obi-Wan had told him. How like Anakin he looked then. Luke's father had worn the same hooded expression whenever Obi-Wan or another elder Jedi had handed him an unexpected lesson. The similarities between them terrified him. No, Obi-Wan stopped. The similarities between Anakin and Luke should have terrified him, but they didn't. This was the detail Obi-Wan had been missing. Everything he'd said to Luke was true, and Luke favored his father quite a bit in most ways, but there was something quieter in his temperament for all that darkness and light still struggled within him. The boy was similarly terrified and enraged by the suffering of others, both strangers and those he held dear. But where Anakin had always felt himself an outsider, set apart from his allies, destined to fail or triumph alone, Luke saw himself not as a hero or a martyr, but as one thread in the tapestry of life. He intuitively understood himself as an expression of the Force, drew his power from it not in great drafts but in small, careful sips, taking only as much strength as he needed for the task at hand. There was a great deal of Anakin in him, but he had inherited mainly Anakin's best qualities. Obi-Wan hadn't killed Anakin Skywalker, but neither had Vader. The best of him lived on in Leia and in Luke. He realized all at once that Luke was watching him carefully, that his expression had been entirely open. Luke must have seen his relief. "What is it, Master?" Luke asked. Obi-Wan shook his head, still grinning. So this was the lesson the Force had sought to teach him. "It's so good to see you, Luke. I should have said so before." "Ben, am I ready for this?" "Trust in the Force, Luke," Obi-Wan said, "and in yourself." The final confrontation between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader was one of the most important moments in the entire Star Wars saga. Obi-Wan became one with the Force, completing the training passed down from Qui-Gon and Yoda. Darth Vader finally vanquished his old master and sank deeper into the suffering of the dark side. And Luke Skywalker suffered another loss, becoming even more determined to learn the ways of the Jedi. In the canon book Star Wars from a Certain Point of View, we are finally shown Obi-Wan's perspective during his duel with Vader and his thoughts as he died and became one with the Force. As Obi-Wan entered the ether of the Force, his consciousness maintained within the physical realm despite his body being gone, he experienced visions of the past, present, and future. He saw his younger self, exiled on Tatooine, hoping to help the young Luke in any way he could. He saw a newborn baby cradled in his arms as Padme Amidala released her last breath. He watched Qui-Gon sink to his knees on Naboo. He saw eyes corrupted by the dark side, burning yellow with hatred on the shores of a lava river. Yet his vision also returned to his duel with Vader, moments before his death, as he relived the confrontation. Obi-Wan saw Vader waiting in the corridor ahead, as silent and motionless as a statue. Vader appeared so calm and controlled, but Obi-Wan could feel his rage seething beneath his mask. He knew that fury threatened to overwhelm Vader, just as it always did, but he managed to restrain it. Obi-Wan was impressed, thinking that the Emperor must have taught his former apprentice well. He always knew this day would come. As Vader stepped forward to meet him, he ignited his lightsaber, and another memory came over him, remembering Padme's last words, insisting that there was still good within Anakin. Obi-Wan wondered if she truly believed that, and decided that he did not. His friend was dead. The dark figure in front of him was not Anakin Skywalker. As Vader spoke of the circle being complete, Obi-Wan felt his own anger rise, his years of training and discipline ebbing away so that he could barely hear what the Sith Lord was saying. Obi-Wan called him Darth, for he could not use his real name. He thought it might undo him to utter Anakin's name again, and decided that the time for talk was at an end. It was time for this to be finished once and for all. As their blades clashed, Obi-Wan saw his own face, old and tired, reflected in Vader's black helmet. Vader was holding back, testing his former master's limits, perhaps seeing how time had diminished Obi-Wan's abilities. As their sabers clashed again, Obi-Wan was thrust backward, as Vader's cybernetic arms overpowered him. Then Obi-Wan's vision lurched again, as the past and present clashed together in the Force. He wondered if this was truly power. Maintaining his consciousness was nothing like Yoda and Qui-Gon had spoken of. He was being overwhelmed by visions. Then he returned to the duel with Vader. Obi-Wan was depleted, his body screaming with pain. He knew that he had no hope of winning the fight. As Vader forced him back again, Obi-Wan sensed that Luke was near, and he felt Luke through the Force, praying that Vader couldn't. He wondered why he had ever listened to Owen, why he waited so long to train Luke. He knew that it was too late now. There was no way to prepare Luke for what was to come. Obi-Wan felt that he had failed until he heard the young boy cry his name and saw Luke watching across the landing bay. And then Obi-Wan heard Qui-Gon's voice telling him to go to Luke. He knew what he needed to do, and he turned to Vader and smiled. All that mattered was Luke. As Obi-Wan closed his eyes, he barely heard the blade of Vader's saber sweeping through the air, but he did hear Luke's anguished cry as Obi-Wan vanished from the physical world. Within the Force, Obi-Wan saw the fight happening in the hangar, and knew that Luke would surely be killed if he stayed for too long. But he had never let the boy be harmed in the past on Tatooine, and he wouldn't let it happen now. So he whispered words that only Luke could hear, telling him to run, and Luke listened. Obi-Wan was at Luke's side, forever in the Force. In the Duel of the Fates, the Sith Lord Darth Maul was more powerful than both Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi. As the duel went on, Maul was even disgusted by how weak and lacking in skill the two Jedi were, and he considered them to be pathetic. Of course, we know that Maul was able to kill Qui-Gon, but then he was inexplicably cut in half and defeated by Obi-Wan a few moments later, although he did survive. So how was Obi-Wan able to do this? Why did Maul get bisected so easily? This moment has been torn apart by fans for years, but there is context given in the lore, both in the novelization of The Phantom Menace and the Legends book The Wrath of Darth Maul. Free at last of the laser wall, Obi-Wan charged out of the tunnel and into the chamber, abandoning any pretense of observing even the slightest caution. He barreled into Darth Maul with such fury that he almost knocked both of them into the abyss. He struck at the Sith Lord with his lightsaber as if his own safety meant nothing, lost in a red haze of rage and frustration, consumed by his grief for Qui-Gon and his failure to prevent his master's death. The struggle took them around the edge of the pit, and for a time it was fought evenly. But Darth Maul was much stronger, driven by a frenzy that surpassed even the frantic determination of Obi-Wan. Eventually, the Sith Lord began to wear the young Jedi down. Obi-Wan could sense his body weakening, and his fear of what it would mean if he too were to fall. He struggled to heed Qui-Gon's teachings, to contain the emotions warring within and wearing him down. Sensing his opportunity slipping away and his strength fading, Obi-Wan mounted a final assault. As their blades locked, Maul was able to use the Force to push Obi-Wan backward. Maul grinned as he walked towards Obi-Wan's fallen lightsaber and kicked it into the core. He leaned over the edge to watch the lightsaber fall down the apparently bottomless hole. The lightsaber fell past Obi-Wan, who had managed to grab hold of a nub that jutted out from the core's upper wall, about 2 meters below the floor level. Maul glared at Obi-Wan. He wondered how long the Jedi could cling to the nub. He knew Obi-Wan's hands and arms would get tired eventually. Growing impatient, Maul swung his lightsaber against the metal edge of the core's upper rim, sending sparks flying out over Obi-Wan's head. Maul's eyes were wild with triumph as he savored his victory, and then he noticed Obi-Wan was not looking up at him, but at something along the core's upper wall, or beyond it. Baffled by what the young Jedi might be attempting, Maul scrunched his face angrily. Obi-Wan went deep inside himself, connecting with the Force he had worked so hard to understand. Calming himself, stilling the trembling of his heart, and banishing his anger and fear, he called upon the last of his reserves. With clarity of purpose and strength of heart, he launched himself out of the pit, imbued with the power of the Force. Maul had completely forgotten about Qui-Gon Jinn's lightsaber, which flew up from the floor near the fallen Jedi's body and landed in the hand of the still airborne Obi-Wan. Maul rapidly transferred his lightsaber from his right to left hand, but even before he could turn and defend himself, Obi-Wan slashed through his midsection. So basically, as explained by the books, Obi-Wan's movement happened a lot faster in real time. Obviously, things can only be shown so fast on film so that the audience can understand what's happening, but we can assume that since these beings are using the Force to fight and they're essentially superpowered, it's actually all happening even faster than we see it. Maul forgot about Qui-Gon's saber and was already celebrating his victory, and Obi-Wan was able to jump over him so quickly by calling on the Force for power and speed, so Maul couldn't turn and react fast enough. As Anakin and Obi-Wan rushed across Geonosis in pursuit of Count Dooku, desperate to confront the fallen Jedi before he could escape, Obi-Wan had already accepted that he could not defeat Dooku alone. Their brief duel in the hangar, with Dooku defeating Obi-Wan fairly easily, is often criticized by fans, and I've seen it in my comment sections on past videos about this duel. Most of the confusion comes from Obi-Wan using Form 3, Sorisu, which is a defensive form, and Obi-Wan later defeating Anakin after Anakin had killed Count Dooku. So how was Dooku able to defeat Obi-Wan so easily? Was it a measure of power in the Force or simple skill with a lightsaber? In the novelization of Attack of the Clones, there is some explanation given, as well as a look into Obi-Wan's thoughts as he engaged Dooku alone, knowing that he could not win without Anakin's help. As Obi-Wan engaged the Count, he did so in a measured and defensive manner, cautious after Anakin had been so easily incapacitated. As he attacked, Dooku easily parried his blows with slight movements, sending Obi-Wan's blade away from its mark. As he attacked again, his offense seemed exaggerated and inefficient against Dooku's blade work. The Count simply deflected or blocked each strike without seeming to move very much. While Obi-Wan and most of the Jedi were sword fighters, Dooku was a fencer, utilizing an older fighting style, Form 2 Makashi, which was developed specifically for lightsaber dueling. The Jedi Order as a whole had all but abandoned the practice of Makashi, considering it almost irrelevant against the enemies of the present galaxy, but Dooku had always held stubbornly to it, considering it among the highest of fighting disciplines. Makashi emphasized precise strikes and well-balanced footwork, as the user would keep both of their feet aligned, advancing and retreating along a single line. Skilled duelists utilizing Makashi would be able to end their fights quickly by penetrating their opponent's defenses and landing a mark of contact with their saber. As the battle between Dooku and Obi-Wan played out on Geonosis, Makashi showed its brilliance. Since Dooku displayed a mastery of Makashi's defensive practices, Obi-Wan was forced onto the offensive, which was the complete opposite of what his practice of Form 3, Sorisu, was intended for. Sorisu was focused on building an impenetrable defensive wall around the user, deflecting all attacks, until the opponent exhausted themselves and began to make mistakes. However, against Dooku, that wasn't even an option for Obi-Wan. The Count had control of the duel from the beginning, forcing Obi-Wan to attack first. Dooku remained on that single line with his footwork, effortlessly remaining in perfect balance as he shifted into defense and then launched into offense. After another series of attacks, Obi-Wan found himself fatigued, gasping for breath. Yet he attempted to steady himself and attacked again, fiercely. The Count continued to fend off his strikes, drawing Obi-Wan too far forward as he prepared to counterattack. Then it was Dooku taking the offensive, stabbing and striking so quickly that Obi-Wan's parries could not move fast enough to meet his red blade. As such, Dooku was able to quickly land two blows, one to Obi-Wan's shoulder and another to his thigh. So, while Obi-Wan was utilizing Sorisu during this duel, he wasn't able to practice it as intended, and he had not yet achieved mastery of the form. He wasn't considered the master of Sorisu until 3 years later at the end of the Clone Wars. Dooku utilized Makashi with great effect, using his skill in dueling to force Obi-Wan onto the offensive, which allowed him to win. Obi-Wan had already accepted that he couldn't defeat Dooku alone, and the Count simply used his skills with a lightsaber to win. Obi-Wan Kenobi served as Luke Skywalker's first master, introducing the young boy to the Force and the ways of the Jedi. In canon, after sacrificing himself on the Death Star, Obi-Wan appeared to Yoda as a Force ghost, asking the old Grand Master to train Luke as his final Padawan. While Yoda was initially reluctant, Obi-Wan insisted that Luke would redeem the Jedi, and was the only one who could confront the Sith. During Luke's training with Yoda, Obi-Wan was always watching from the netherworld of the Force, pondering not only Luke's flaws and obstacles, but Anakin's as well. In the canon book The Empire Strikes Back from a Certain Point of View, there is an entire story from Obi-Wan's perspective, revealing his thoughts on Luke's training and what was going through his mind as Luke foolishly rushed to save his friends on Bespin. I had hoped that dying would be enough to untangle me from the Skywalker family's issues, and yet here I am again, Obi-Wan Kenobi, one with the Force and still the only thing standing between a Skywalker and an impulsive decision that could have galactic consequences. Tatooine had by no means been a glamorous locale for exile, though I had no choice but to settle myself near Luke's new guardians. Yoda, however, with an entire galaxy at his fingertips, had been so determined to make a meal of his martyrdom that he chose Dagobah as his refuge, the only planet that smells worse than the Jedi Temple training rooms after a combat class with 14-year-olds. Death is better than Dagobah, I think, as the swamp world crystallizes around me. I'm shocked Luke stayed this long. If it were Anakin sent here, with minimal instructions delivered to him by a ghost, only to see his ship swallowed by a sinkhole, Yoda cracking his droid on the dome, then deeming him unteachable before they'd had a chance to talk about anything beyond Yoda's terrible cooking, he would have been grinding his teeth in that way that used to drive me mad. All that, plus the low ceilings, the perpetual damp, and snakes in places they had no business being. The moment the rain started, Anakin would have stormed out of the hut loudly reciting an itemized list of frustrations to no one in particular. If he'd been unable to get his X-Wing out of the swamp, I have no doubt Anakin would have found a way to walk off the planet. But Luke had stayed, and Master Yoda had taught him. And I only had to appear to Yoda in half a dozen of his dreams to convince him that Luke was not Anakin, and this time would be different. We are all better than we had been before. Or not better, but at least we knew what not to do when it comes to training chosen ones. Through the swampy mist rising off the soil, I see Luke throwing supplies into the cargo bay of his X-Wing, hasty and disorganized, shouting over his shoulder at Yoda. I seem to have arrived mid-rant, and though Luke has yet to notice me, I doubt my presence would have done much to quell his passion. Anakin never held his tongue around his elders. The Skywalkers are wildfires, their passions scorching the dirt as soon as they're given a spark. Even Leia was already well known for her ability to set the Empire on fire with nothing but a wet match. Relentless was the word Bail had most often used when he had sent me reports about her. Her mother would have been proud. Luke shouts about his friends as he darts nimbly around the edge of his X-Wing to fiddle with the control panel in the cockpit. His orange flight suit looks garish amid the greens and browns of the swamp, a smudge of flame in the gloom. From his perch atop the ship, R2-D2 whistles his ascent, ever the instigator. "I've got to help them," Luke says. "You must not go," Yoda replies. He's huddled on the ground beneath the nose of the X-Wing, and though I have only ever known a stooped, slow-moving Yoda, somehow he seems even shakier on his feet than the last time I was here. He's leaning heavily on his gnarled cane as it sinks into the mud, his posture the curled crook of a being who has become too accustomed to living in darkness. "But Han and Leia will die if I don't," Luke replies ferociously, dropping off the ladder of his starfighter. Since no one is pointing out the obvious flaw in that logic, I feel the need to finally intervene. "You don't know that," I say dryly. Luke doesn't look surprised as he turns to me. This isn't the first time I've had to make an appearance here to facilitate a group therapy session with him and Yoda. His hair has gotten longer since I last saw him, and it falls over the scars that have rearranged one side of his face since the Wampa attack. I had hoped that death and time and oneness with the Force might take the edge off the strangeness of seeing Anakin's eyes in his son's face. But now, as they blaze with the same determination I saw so many times in life, it overwhelms me. I had spent years and years in that tiny sand cell on Tatooine, sweating and perpetually dehydrated and with nothing to do but relive everything I could have done differently and then slowly let each one go, trying to make peace with losing Anakin. But the shades of him in his son's face catapult me back in time, and all the years I spent by Anakin's side, fighting and teaching and laughing and arguing and nearly dying and saving each other over and over again, spill out across my mind. And now here is his son, looking at me with those same flushed cheeks, caring too much about everything, and both my life and death would be so much easier if the Skywalkers didn't care so much. How different this galaxy would be if the Skywalkers didn't care so much. It isn't about Anakin anymore, I remind myself, struggling to return to the present moment. It's about Luke, and not letting him make the same mistakes his father and I did. Why even in death must I chide myself to focus on now and here, like I'm a Padawan struggling to sit still? Even Yoda cannot see their fate, I say. But I can help them, Luke protests. I feel the Force. But you cannot control it. In his early days of training, Anakin had always been so tentative in speaking about the Force, like it was a word in a foreign language whose meaning he still wasn't entirely sure of. With Luke, There's no hesitation, even though the concept was only introduced to him a few years earlier. Now, when he needs a reason to go, the Force is telling him exactly what to do, like it's a guidebook I'd been recommending to him. That's not how the Force works, I think, and resist the urge to rub my temples, a habit Anakin had always teased me about. Luke turns away, shoving a hand through his hair. I look to Yoda with a silent plea to back me up, but he seems to have taken my arrival as an invitation to move into the back seat of this teaching moment. This is a dangerous time for you, I say to Luke, when you will be tempted by the dark side of the Force. Yoda suddenly seems to remember that he's the only living authority figure here, and he pipes up. Yes, yes, to Obi-Wan you listen. The cave. Remember your failure at the cave. I don't know what cave he refers to, but I don't ask. I don't need another reason to doubt Luke. I had always doubted Anakin, and he had felt that wobble in our foundation from the start. Add it to the list of mistakes I was trying not to make again. But I've learned so much since then, Luke protests, and I resist the urge to snort. As though carrying Yoda on your shoulders and eating his terrible cooking for a few weeks makes you a Jedi. Master Yoda, I promise to return and finish what I've begun. You have my word. Why did I come? I lost this fight before it even began. Anakin never learned how to back down from an argument, even if he had definitely been proved wrong. Why did I think Luke should be any different? You can't keep a promise if you're dead, Luke, I want to say. And you'll be dead if you go because it is clear to everyone here but you that this is a trap. Which I can't say because you're your father's stubborn son, and it will only make you want to argue more. The Skywalkers don't listen. Every argument I ever had with Anakin, it felt like he was fighting with a version of me in his head rather than actually confronting the things I was saying. The Skywalkers could level planets with their obstinacy. Instead, I say, it is you and your abilities the Emperor wants, which is as close to the truth as I can creep without telling him who passed those abilities onto him. That is why your friends are made to suffer. And that is why I have to go, Luke replies. I blink several times, waiting for him to realize how little sense that argument makes. He doesn't. Luke turns back to his X-Wing, swinging the door to the cargo bay shut, and frustration wells inside me. It's a struggle to tamp it down. I am still a Jedi. I am still in control of myself and my feelings, but I never had a hold on my own heart when it came to Anakin. That was part of his undoing. Luke, I call as he mounts the ladder leading to the cockpit. Desperation splits my voice. How is it I have dealt with this family for generations and still haven't figured out how to get through to them? I don't want to lose you to the Emperor the way I lost. I fumble. What I want to say is Anakin. What I want to say is my best friend. What I want to say is your father, the way we both lost him. To a needless war, to a wild heart, to a doomed prophecy. Instead, I finish Vader. Luke turns back to me, and there it is again, the wild glint in his eyes. There is Anakin. You won't, Luke says. Stopped they must be. Yoda is starting to sound frustrated, which is a testament to just how infuriating Luke is. Even Anakin rarely cracked Master Yoda. On this all depends. Only a fully trained Jedi Knight with the Force as his ally will conquer Vader and the Emperor. If you end your training now, if you choose the quick and easy path as Vader did, you will become an agent of evil. I glance down at Yoda, resisting the urge to argue. A divided front won't do us any good in persuading Luke to listen, but I want to point out that Anakin's path was never easy. I don't know why I am defending Anakin, even in my own head, especially after he killed me. Luke looks between us, his eyes suddenly pleading. He wants to go, but more than that, he wants us to tell him he's right, that he's doing the right thing. The Skywalkers always want to do the right thing. It's what gets them every time. All I say is patience. And sacrifice Han and Leia, Luke shoots back. If you honor what they fight for, Yoda replies, yes. Luke's face sets, and then he turns away from us, His hand is strangling the struts of the ladder leading up to the cockpit. If you choose to face Vader, I say, you will do it alone. I cannot interfere. I say it mostly in the hope it will scare him into staying. He's never truly fought alone before. He's never been alone before. He hardly knows Han and Leia, and doesn't yet know who Leia is to him, and already his heart has put down deep roots, just like his father. With Anakin, it was his mother, then Qui-Gon and me, and Ahsoka and Padme. Childhood abandonment resulting in him clinging with white knuckles to whoever was nearest him. Luke presses his forehead against the ladder, and I think for a moment I've scared him enough that he'll stay. But then he says quietly, I understand. He turns back to us just for a moment, and there he is again, the son of my friend who could never be talked out of anything he set his mind to. R2, Luke calls as he mounts the ladder, fire up the converters. Luke, I call, one last attempt, but when he turns back to me, the words die in my throat. Everything I want to say to him suddenly feels hollow and untrue. The language of the Jedi that I had spouted for years, first to Anakin, now to his son. For every way the Council had broken Anakin down, I had stood by and let them. I had been their arbiter of justice, repeating the language they had given me. Why didn't I fight for Anakin, I think? So instead, I offer the only advice I have. Don't give in to hate. That leads to the dark side. Strong is Vader, Yoda adds. Mind what you have learned. Save you it can. Luke tugs the strap of his helmet into place. I will, he says, and I'll return. I promise. If only those were the sort of promises we could keep, I think. The cockpit of the X-Wing closes with a pneumatic hiss, and the swamp debris beneath it is blown aside as the engines fire. The starfighter lifts off, casting Yoda and I into darkness. Told you I did, Yoda murmurs, his face to the sky, and I wonder if he resents ghosts like me for arriving without warning. Reckless is he. Now, matters are worse. That boy is our last hope, I say, and in my voice, I hear every Jedi before me who brought us here, dead and desperate and up to our knees in a swamp. But Yoda shakes his head. No, there is another. And it's a long, quiet moment between us before I remind myself it isn't Anakin. He's not here anymore, and neither am I. By the time that Anakin was brought before the Jedi Order, he was older than most initiates and possessed a strong attachment to his mother, which is why the Council refused to accept him. As we know, Anakin became the Padawan of Obi-Wan in order to honor Qui-Gon's dying wishes, but the Jedi were always very aware of Anakin's issues with attachment and possession. In the Legends Encyclopedia, Jedi vs. Sith, The Essential Guide to the Force, there is a passage written by Obi-Wan, where he gives his true thoughts on Anakin's struggles with attachment as a Jedi. It has been 3 years since Anakin Skywalker became my Padawan learner. His powers continue to grow, and all of his instructors at the Jedi Temple acknowledge that his abilities exceed those not only of other students his age, but of many instructors as well. However, every Jedi Master has also noted that Anakin continues to exhibit behavior and emotions that are characteristic of Force users who did not begin Jedi training at infancy. As might be expected of anyone who has been liberated from slavery, he can be outspoken regarding social injustices. I have assured him that all Jedi must develop a sense of patience, something he has difficulty maintaining. Of greater concern are his impulsiveness, competitiveness, and occasional arrogance. I admit there have been several times that I have been at a loss for words for his actions. I must remind myself of various instances when I confounded or disappointed my own master, and that I too was once impatient to become a Jedi. As my Padawan, Anakin has become a strong part of my life, yet he remains something of a mystery to me. Recently, I found him gazing up at the night sky. Although Coruscant's atmosphere is too polluted for stargazing, I suspected he was looking in the direction of Tatooine. I know that from an orbital skyhook, Tatooine's twin suns would appear to the naked eye as a dim single star, and had found Anakin searching for that point of light on previous occasions. Feeling sympathetic, I asked him if he was thinking of his mother. He kept his eyes skyward as he answered that he was thinking of mine. His tone was not unkind or antagonistic, but I did sense a certain tension in his words. I asked why he was thinking of my mother, and he said, fixing me with an expression that indicated his answer was obvious, because someone should. I didn't know what to say to that. Anakin knows that a Jedi must relinquish familial attachments, but I suddenly found myself more concerned for his future than ever before. He misses his mother. I know this as well as anything. Although he left Tatooine willingly, he left a part of himself there. I can only offer him guidance, but if he is the chosen one, it seems inevitable that he must free himself from that bond. Anakin's brutal slaughter of a Tusken camp in an act of revenge for his mother's kidnapping and death was one of the first moments that the young Jedi stepped closer to the dark side. The violent event was sensed by Yoda, though he could not discern the specific details, and even the disembodied spirit of Qui-Gon Jinn attempted to intervene. Afterwards, Anakin confessed his dark deed to Padme and Chancellor Palpatine, but one person he never told was his master, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Obi-Wan would have to discover the truth for himself, many years later during his exile on Tatooine in the Legends novel The Life and Legend of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Shortly after his arrival on Tatooine, Obi-Wan kept himself busy by exploring the dunes and desert around the Lars homestead. He had taken to visiting the homestead quietly twice a day, at sunrise and sunset, just to make sure Luke was alright. Whenever he rode his Eopie, he was always mindful of his surroundings and on the lookout for any danger. He had heard of a recent increase in Tusken Raider sightings, and was fairly certain that at least one tribe had become aware of his presence on their land. Recently, while exploring the vast area around the Lars homestead, he had come upon what appeared to be the ruins of a camp in a canyon in the Junland Wastes. He had traveled close enough to the ruins to see a cluster of bantha rib arches sticking in the sand, all that remained of several small huts, the kind used by the nomadic Tuskens. Seeing the ruins, Obi-Wan had suddenly been overcome by a feeling of loneliness and despair, which ended a moment later when a distant, blood-chilling howl echoed down from a nearby clifftop. He suspected that he may have wandered into an area that was somehow sacred to the Tuskens, and he proceeded past the ruins quickly, unable to inspect them any further. He would not learn any additional information until he was caught in the middle of a conflict between local farmers and a Tusken tribe led by a warrior named Ayark in the Legends novel Kenobi. Obi-Wan attempted to mediate the escalating war between the two groups, and he gained Ayark's trust since she was familiar with the Jedi thanks to the Tusken Jedi Sharad Het. It was Ayark that revealed that the Tuskens had become weaker because of a massacre that occurred more than 3 cycles earlier. She told Obi-Wan that a camp of mighty warriors had been wiped away, including their women and children. Obi-Wan was curious and shocked, and wondered whether a krayt dragon or some other predator had devoured the camp. Ayark confirmed that it was indeed a predator, but one that walked on 2 legs. Obi-Wan stated that the farmers didn't usually kill Tusken women or children, and Ayark agreed, saying that the farmers would usually orphan Tuskens and abandon them in the desert, but the predator had slaughtered everyone. Obi-Wan suddenly pieced some information together in the back of his mind, imagining a scenario that filled his thoughts with absolute horror, before resolving to look into the mysterious event another time. He suspected that the pride and confidence of the Tuskens was not the only victim of that massacre. Obi-Wan would not get his definitive answer until 2 years later, in the life and legend of Obi-Wan Kenobi, when there was a sudden increase in Tusken attacks across the desert. He was disturbed by the dark disturbance in the Force that emanated from those Tusken raids on local moisture farms, and on his way to check on the Lars homestead, he found himself again near the ruins of the camp he had discovered not long after his arrival on Tatooine. Those ruins had always cast a dreadful feeling onto him whenever he neared it, and he had never felt compelled to inspect it more closely. However, on this particular day, the feeling was worse, practically sickening, and yet Obi-Wan sensed that the place was somehow beckoning him. He approached the camp on foot, noticing the bantha rib supports used for Tusken huts, and how amidst the remnants of one hut, the ribs were splattered with dried blood. Then he saw 2 rawhide strips that dangled from the arched ribs. Noting the height and position of the strips, he knew immediately that they had been used to secure a captive human's outstretched arms. And then it hit him. He didn't just sense it through the Force, he knew it for a fact already. This was where Anakin's mother had died. For a moment, he had to resist the urge to tear his eyes away from the strips because he feared if he did, the ruins might disappear along with the knowledge that came with them. When he finally did pry his gaze away from the blood-stained arches, he saw the numerous bones that poked up through the sand around and throughout the ruins, bones that were much too small to have come from banthas. Obi-Wan knew they were the remains of the Tuskens who lived in the camp, slaughtered by Anakin. Suddenly, the disembodied voice of Qui-Gon Jinn spoke into his mind, simply stating that now Obi-Wan knew the truth. He was so stunned by what lay in front of him that he didn't even flinch at the sound of Qui-Gon's voice. Instead, Obi-Wan asked his old master why he never told him the truth about Anakin's massacre. Qui-Gon replied that he withheld the truth simply because Obi-Wan was not ready to know, and still wasn't ready. Obi-Wan said that if Qui-Gon believed that he wasn't ready to understand what happened in the camp, he was mistaken. He stated that Anakin had killed an entire tribe of Tuskens and kept it a secret from everyone, and asked Qui-Gon how he could have known about this yet still maintained that Anakin was the chosen one. Qui-Gon ignored that question, instead stating that Anakin had not kept the slaughter a secret from everyone. Obi-Wan sighed, and knew that Anakin must have told Padme and most likely Palpatine. He also realized that if Anakin hadn't told Owen Lars about it, then Owen must have discovered it for himself, making the farmer believe that the Jedi were prone to murder in the name of revenge. Obi-Wan gathered that that explained why Owen was so wary of his presence and did not trust him. Qui-Gon interrupted his contemplation with another question, asking why Anakin kept the secret from him. Obi-Wan replied that it didn't matter whom Anakin told, only that he was a Jedi and became a butcher. Qui-Gon told him that he shouldn't judge when he failed to understand. Obi-Wan became exasperated with his old master's comments, asking what he was supposed to understand. Qui-Gon repeated that Obi-Wan was still not ready to know. Sighing, frustrated, and still emotional due to the recent revelations, Obi-Wan began to walk away from the ruins, telling Qui-Gon that he hoped to learn the answer to his questions whenever he was ready. So this is just a really interesting and beautiful story because I never knew that Obi-Wan did discover the truth about Anakin slaughtering the Tusken camp, and it is a pretty interesting thing that Qui-Gon never told him. I also think that it's a great detail to have Owen know the truth about what Anakin did, and have that just be another big reason that he doesn't trust the Jedi or Obi-Wan. It just gives some great depth to his character and really ties the prequels and the original trilogy together, in my opinion. In 22 BBY, while the Separatist crisis began to gain momentum in the galaxy, the Commerce Guild and the CIS sought to add more planets to their cause. Ancion became their next target, due to the world acting as a linchpin for several treaties tied to other more important planets. If Ancion seceded from the Republic, it would cause a chain reaction that would rip more than 40 worlds from the Republic as well. To deal with the crisis on Ancion, the Senate sent 2 teams of Jedi, consisting of Masters Luminara Unduli and Obi-Wan Kenobi, and their Padawans Barriss Offee and Anakin Skywalker. Their mission was to convince Ancion to remain within the Republic. While there, Obi-Wan, Luminara, and even Barriss all regarded Anakin with curiosity, recognizing that he was truly a unique Jedi Padawan. In their first encounter on Ancion, Barriss studied Anakin's behavior after they had defeated a group of attackers, noticing that he wore confidence like a handmade suit and smiled cockily after their victory. In conversation, Barriss compared the current tensions on Ancion to the Naboo crisis 10 years earlier, and remarked how Anakin was present during that conflict. She noticed the pride Anakin emanated when speaking of Naboo, and mused that he was indeed a unique Padawan. He seemed to be strange, but not in an unlikable way, and she sensed that he was rife with internal conflicts, yet there was no denying his obvious strength in the Force. The two of them seemed to get along in a friendly enough way, yet Barriss was uncertain about Anakin's personality. She could see that Anakin was very sure of himself, and that he wanted to know and do everything immediately. Perhaps she was mistaking his confidence for arrogance. They were close enough in age, yet Anakin struck Barriss as somewhat childlike in some ways and mature in others, and she wondered if she would have any time to get to know him, since they hadn't become acquainted in the Jedi Temple. Much later, the tension between the two Padawans, as well as Anakin's uniqueness, was sensed by Luminara. When she observed the slight tension between Barriss and Anakin, sharing her thoughts with Obi-Wan, she stated that she could sense the strength of the Force in Anakin, like a wild river that needed to be tamed. Obi-Wan explained that Anakin had come unreasonably late to training, and he was raised by his mother to a greater age than the usual Padawan. Luminara was shocked that Anakin knew his mother, since such an attachment presented all kinds of complications and difficulties. Obi-Wan agreed, and admitted for that reason alone he normally would not have accepted Anakin as his apprentice. However, he was determined to respect Qui-Gon's dying wishes that Anakin be trained as a Jedi. Obi-Wan told her that among other complicated matters that arose from his master's death on Naboo, it also meant dealing with the unusual volatile Anakin. When Luminara asked how Anakin's training had gone these past 10 years, Obi-Wan was both critical and complimentary. He admitted that Anakin was often impetuous, which could carry over into dangerous impatience. However, Anakin had overcome and survived substantial ordeals, and he was a great student of Jedi lore, as well as being skilled in lightsaber combat and piloting. Above all, despite Anakin's distaste for some elements of his training like history or politics, Obi-Wan admitted that he still persevered. As they proceeded with their mission, Obi-Wan pointed out that a year before, Anakin would have been complaining about their mission multiple times a day, yet now he restrained himself, so he must be maturing. Luminara inquired as to why Anakin showed signs of stress so frequently. Obi-Wan told her that there were multiple reasons that Anakin felt inner turmoil. He felt obligated to excel in his training, mostly as a result of his difficult upbringing, and above all, he feared that he would never see his mother again. Luminara was very critical of Anakin's attachment to his mother. Since Force-sensitive infants were usually removed from their families before they could form dangerously lasting attachments such as Anakin's, Luminara felt that it was a terrible mistake for Anakin to be trained at all. However, out of genuine curiosity, she asked Obi-Wan if he thought that Anakin would ever see his mother again. Obi-Wan was uncertain, remarking how if it were up to Anakin, he would travel to Tatooine at this very moment. However, the path of a Jedi was not up to them, as they had to follow the orders of where the Council sent them. He said that besides his mother, he could sense other things troubling Anakin. However, whenever he would bring it up, Anakin would deny that any inner turmoil existed. And hearing this, Luminara asked Obi-Wan if, given the amount of self-denial that Anakin possessed, he thought that Anakin would ever become a full Jedi Knight. Obi-Wan replied that he truly didn't know if Anakin ever would attain the rank of Knight, but he had promised Qui-Gon that he would do his best to make it happen. He admitted that he held his doubts about Anakin completing his training at all, yet he would honor his promise, so that if Anakin overcame his internal conflicts and did become a great Jedi, Qui-Gon's judgment would be vindicated. Obi-Wan admitted that there was only so much he could do to help Anakin with his problems, by teaching, advising, and offering a sympathetic ear. However, in the end, only Anakin himself would decide what he would become. When Luminara asked what Anakin's biggest problem was, Obi-Wan conceded that he didn't know the answer to that, and if he did, he would have tried to cure it long ago. He said that one day, perhaps that answer would be unearthed by Anakin himself, which would indeed make for interesting times in the journey of the young Jedi. Obi-Wan's decision to not execute Anakin on Mustafar might seem relatively straightforward, since he had already told Yoda that he didn't have it in him to kill his fallen apprentice. But Obi-Wan's restraint was actually much more complex than that, as he considered not just what Anakin meant to him, but what kind of man and what kind of Jedi he was. His thoughts are explained in the novelization of Revenge of the Sith, but the most shocking detail comes from an excerpt of Obi-Wan's own journal in the Legends Encyclopedia Jedi vs. Sith: The Essential Guide to the Force, which reveals the main reason that Obi-Wan did not kill Anakin. First, the novelization reveals that as Anakin lay burning on the lava bank, Obi-Wan saw Palpatine's shuttle fly overhead, and he knew he was running out of time to escape and save Padme. Looking down at Anakin, he knew that it would be a mercy to execute him, but he did not feel merciful. Obi-Wan felt a calmness settle over him, and thinking clearly, he knew that he did not have time to climb down the bank of black sand. In the end, there was only one choice for him to make, the choice that any Jedi Knight would make. He told himself that regardless of everything that had occurred that day, he was still Obi-Wan Kenobi, and he was still a Jedi Knight. He would not murder a defenseless man. He would leave Anakin's life or death to the will of the Force, so he turned and walked away. Years later, during his exile on Tatooine, Obi-Wan wrote about his duel with Vader in his journal, revealing the main reason that he didn't kill him. "My duel with Vader was awful in its savagery. In the end, he was more determined to kill me than defend himself, and was blind with fury when I defeated him. I left him maimed and burning on the shores of a lava river. To have dealt him a killing blow might have been the merciful thing to do, but because I am a Jedi and not a cold-blooded murderer, all I could do was leave Vader to his fate. Had I killed him then and there, I believe I would have taken a step onto the same dark path that he had found so impossible to resist. But by leaving him for dead, I fear I failed yet again, for I soon learned that Vader had survived, in a fashion. He is mostly machine now, a malevolent construct of pistons and gears, plastoid and wires, his mortal remains fueled by the dark side. The galaxy will never know peace until Darth Vader and the Emperor breathe their last." So, as shocking as it is, the real reason that Obi-Wan didn't kill Anakin on Mustafar was because he believed that he would fall to the dark side if he did. I think that's just fascinating, and it adds another depth to the emotions and the complexity of that entire duel. Obi-Wan Kenobi's relationship with the Sith acolyte Asajj Ventress was incredibly complex, especially in Legends, as she attempted to kill Obi-Wan at every turn while he was determined to redeem her. Obi-Wan pitied Ventress, believing she had been manipulated by Dooku into nurturing the worst parts of herself, and that she wasn't actually an evil being, simply a victim. Even more interesting is the way that Obi-Wan compared Ventress to Anakin, believing that her fate could have just as easily been Anakin's if the Sith had discovered him on Tatooine. Ventress's fate is different in Legends, as she died in Obi-Wan's arms on Boz Pity when Anakin killed her. In the Legends Encyclopedia Jedi vs. Sith The Essential Guide to the Force, there is an excerpt from the journal that Obi-Wan kept during his exile on Tatooine, where he actually mourns Ventress and reflects on her life and death. 2 days ago, on one of my walks, I came across the twisted, withered husk of a short desert plant that had grown in the shadows of a dusty rock formation. Yesterday, I passed the same plant again and noticed it had flowered small white petals, flecked with dark gray. This morning, I was surprised to find the entire plant had vanished. Even though I knew some creature had probably eaten it, I felt a sense of loss that surprised me, and I thought of Asajj Ventress. About 10 weeks after the Battle of Geonosis, Anakin and I had our first encounter with Ventress. She was a humanoid, hairless with pale skin, who wielded 2 lightsabers simultaneously. Before she attacked us, she told me that she had emerged from misery and suffering, only to find the Jedi she had once worshipped were nothing but weak, misguided fools. She added that she agreed with Count Dooku. The galaxy was in need of a Jedi purge. Asajj Ventress escaped that day, but not before she killed one Jedi and maimed his apprentice. It was obvious by her technique that she had received training from Dooku. Over the course of the Clone Wars, Anakin and I faced off against Ventress on other worlds, but despite all her fury and murderous inclinations, I always sensed something within her that distinguished her from the Sith Lords, an underlying fear. Mostly, it was a fear of being alone, and I sensed that there was some good in her, some part that had not been corrupted by Dooku. Where the Sith Lords were unquestionably evil, Ventress was simply a slave to the dark side. Even though Ventress had killed Jedi and other innocents, I managed to convey my hope that she might listen to reason and stop using fear to fuel her anger. She refused to listen. And I was still trying to reason with her when she nearly killed me on Boz Pity. She would have, too, had not Anakin's lightsaber dealt her a mortal blow. Her death, roughly 5 months before the Jedi Purge, did nothing to slow the Clone Wars, for by that time General Grievous was already in command of the Confederacy's droid armies. I thought that Ventress would use her dying breath to curse me and the Jedi Order. Instead, she cautioned me to defend Coruscant from Dooku, for that was the key to victory. Indeed, Dooku and Grievous would assault Coruscant. She even allowed that I might have been right about her all along. And then, she was gone. Now, it is hard for me to see what the future holds. Fortunately, I have my mission and my ongoing studies of the Force to help me be mindful of the present, as well as the daily rigors of survival on Tatooine. Whatever tomorrow may bring, I must be ready for it. I have collected a small number of seeds from my desert walks. I think I will plant them and see what they will grow, in memory of Asajj Ventress. The duel on Mustafar between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker, then active as the Sith Lord Darth Vader, was one of the most important confrontations during the fall of the Republic and the Jedi Order. The duel itself was a meeting of pure offense clashing with pure defense, and the novelization of Revenge of the Sith describes it as an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. Not only that, but Obi-Wan and Anakin knew each other as closely as they possibly could, so close that they were regarded as forming two halves of one complete warrior. Their styles complemented each other perfectly, which is why their duel was one of the most complex and complicated engagements of all time. The most pivotal element of the duel that ultimately led to Anakin's defeat was Obi-Wan's absolute mastery of Form 3, Sorisu. Sorisu, also known as the Resilience Form and the Way of the Mynock, was the third form of lightsaber combat created by the Jedi Order. Developed in response to the introduction of blasters in the galaxy, Sorisu focused on defense more than offense. With the development of Sorisu, Jedi also discovered the ability to reflect blaster bolts back at their attackers, which was considered a breakthrough in overall lightsaber combat. However, the use of the form against blaster-wielding enemies was only one way to use Sorisu. Jedi also trained to block and parry lightsaber strikes, engage numerous opponents simultaneously, and above all, remain calm and focused in combat, allowing for the perfect defensive response to any threat. Sorisu required a thoughtful, intellectual approach to all aspects of combat, meaning the user needed to rely on their mental strength as much as agility and speed. Because the form maintained emphasis on tightly controlled movements to maintain total defensive positioning, the physical requirements of the user were somewhat more relaxed compared to the other forms. Sorisu emphasized not only immediate tactics based on the situation, but also a broader strategic view of whatever conflict the user was in. This allowed for the user to efficiently adapt to incoming attacks, using defensive strategy to withstand any enemy. This is also why Sorisu was known as the Resilience form. Its use was heavily dependent on outlasting opponents by focusing entirely on defense. By committing all mental focus to the enemy, a true Sorisu master would be able to take full advantage of their enemy's most exploitable opening. While the enemy would gradually grow exhausted or frustrated, the Sorisu user would maintain their calm and tranquil focus, allowing their defense to remain impenetrable. This is exactly what Obi-Wan did to Anakin on Mustafar. By the time of their duel, Obi-Wan had achieved mastery of Sorisu, even being regarded as the ultimate master of the form by Mace Windu. His use of Sorisu was the perfect counter to Anakin's mastery of Form 5, which was entirely based on offense. Anakin utilized the Gem-So variant of Form 5 against Obi-Wan, which focused on aggressive counterattacks and using sheer strength to overwhelm the opponent through brute force. However, Obi-Wan's mastery of Sorisu and the way he utilized it allowed him to withstand Anakin's offensive onslaught. As Anakin attacked, Obi-Wan maintained his impenetrable defense, giving ground intentionally as he worked to outlast his fallen apprentice. As the duel progressed, Anakin grew increasingly frustrated by his inability to break through Obi-Wan's guard. This frustration, bolstered by the negative emotions of the dark side, caused Anakin's judgment to become clouded. He began to make mistakes and leave openings in his own defense. Meanwhile, Obi-Wan devoted himself fully to the practices of Sorisu, maintaining a calm state of mind and his defensive guard. Analyzing the tactical advantages of his surroundings, Obi-Wan was able to gain the high ground over Anakin, knowing that the latter was likely to make another mistake. Anakin's frustration did boil over, and he made the horrible decision of trying to jump over Obi-Wan, allowing the Jedi Master to mutilate him and end the duel. His victory was truly remarkable, given Anakin's raw power in the Force and unmatched skill in lightsaber combat. By following the way of Sorisu, perfectly embodying the name of the Resilience form, Obi-Wan used his defensive mastery to outlast Anakin for the entire duel and emerge victorious. When Obi-Wan was captured on Geonosis and interrogated by Count Dooku, the Sith Lord made a surprising offer, asking Obi-Wan for his help in destroying the Sith. While at first it may seem that this was simply a ploy to gain Obi-Wan's trust and betray him, there is actually a much deeper reasoning for Dooku attempting to recruit him. Dooku's Padawan was Qui-Gon Jinn, who was Obi-Wan's master, connecting the three men with a bond in the Force. Dooku's reasoning for wanting Obi-Wan as an ally is fully explained in the novelization of Revenge of the Sith, as Dooku and Palpatine waited for Obi-Wan and Anakin to reach them aboard General Grievous's ship. The false plan that Palpatine had presented to Dooku involved him killing Obi-Wan in order to push Anakin to fall to the dark side. Dooku was then supposed to toy with Anakin, allowing himself to be defeated so he could be arrested and become a prisoner of the Republic, only to be released once Palpatine created the new Empire. Dooku was tricked into thinking that he would remain Palpatine's apprentice, while Anakin would merely serve as their acolyte. While he was eager to forge a new Sith Empire, Dooku had several reservations with this false plan, with the largest one being the death of Obi-Wan. As Master and Apprentice waited for the two Jedi to reach them, Dooku expressed his wish to give Obi-Wan one last chance to turn to the dark side, asking Palpatine for permission. Dooku argued that a Jedi of Obi-Wan's integrity would be invaluable in establishing the legitimacy of their new empire. Palpatine knew that Dooku had held an interest in Obi-Wan for quite some time. Dooku explained that it was only logical, since Obi-Wan's master was his Padawan, making Obi-Wan practically his grandson. But Palpatine replied that Obi-Wan was too old, too indoctrinated into the ways of the Jedi, poisoned by their tenets, and Dooku had already established that on Geonosis years earlier. Dooku was still not eager to kill Obi-Wan, but he supposed that he should have no trouble doing so, since he had ordered the Jedi Master's death once already in the Geonosian arena. Palpatine insisted that Obi-Wan needed to die, as his death would be the final key to make Anakin their Sith servant. Dooku understood that as long as Obi-Wan was still alive, he would be the largest obstacle in regards to Anakin's corruption. He still had his reservations, but he realized that his idea for substituting Obi-Wan for Anakin was misguided. Dooku rationed that his desire to spare Obi-Wan spawned from some misplaced form of sentimentality, and that Anakin was the far superior candidate to serve them. Thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed it, and may the Force be with you.